On a snowy Christmas night in 1914, an old boarding house at the edge of an industrial city gathers 5 strangers around a single flickering table light. None of them have family nearby. Yet before the candles burn low, they will trade stories of rivers and letters, silver thread and ticking stars, and discover that something quiet and magical has been waiting for them in the house all along. The first snow of December had been falling since late afternoon, a soft and patient curtain drifting from a pale sky. By evening, the industrial city lay under a thin white quilt, its harsh lines softened, its sooty roofs dusted with fragile brightness. Chimneys still breathed out slow ribbons of smoke, but the factory yards were growing quiet now, their iron gates closed, their clamor muted. The distant clang of metal on metal had faded into memory, leaving only the muffled roll of a cart somewhere on a side street and the occasional call of a newsboy. Over everything, the snow kept falling, gentle and steady, as if the sky meant to hush the city into a peaceful, dreaming silence. On a narrow street, not far from the old railway line, a brick boarding house stood with its shoulders hunched against the cold. The building was tall and slightly stern, with soot-darkened walls and narrow windows, but this evening it looked almost softened by the white that gathered on its ledges. Snow had settled on the worn stone steps, outlining each riser in a delicate trim. A small iron railing ran up to the front door, its black bars faintly silvered where frost had caught and held the light from the street lamp. In the lamplight, the snowflakes glimmered as they passed, each one a tiny, drifting star, quiet and unhurried. Inside, Mrs. Harrow moved from room to room with her habitual, quiet care. She was not a tall woman, but there was a kind of steady strength in the way she walked, feet sure on the boards she had polished for years, hands accustomed to carrying trays and coal scuttles and baskets of laundry. Her hair, once rich brown, had gone gray at the temples, and she wore it in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. The apron over her dark dress was clean and crisp, and the keys at her waist chimed softly when she turned. This house was her living, but more than that, it was her duty, and in a modest, private way, her pride. She struck a match in the dim front hall and lit the first gas lamp, then the next, each flame blooming into a gentle golden globe. The light reached out across the wallpaper, across the narrow stair, across the framed print of a country scene that hung by the hat rack. As each lamp awoke, shadows drew back into the corners, and the house seemed to breathe more easily. It was always like this on winter evenings. The outside world grew colder and darker, and the boarding house countered with its own small constellation of lights, its own calm warmth. In the parlor, the fire was already laid. Mrs. Harrow knelt before the grate and coaxed it to life, her hands practiced, her movements smooth. Kindling caught with a faint crackle, then flared, and soon the small coal fire glowed in a deep, steady red. The flames did not leap high. They bent and whispered, twining around the blackened bars, spreading a gentle warmth into the room. Shadows fluttered and settled along the floral wallpaper. The modest armchairs, a little worn at the arms, seemed to turn toward the hearth, patient and inviting, as if they had been waiting all day for this moment of quiet. She moved to the window and drew the curtains back just an inch, enough to look out. The street was almost empty now. A single figure moved in the distance, hurrying home, shoulders hunched against the snow. Light spilled from a shop on the corner, but most windows were dim or dark. Above them all, the sky was a pale gray sheet, with the moon hidden somewhere behind it, casting a thin, diffuse brightness. The falling flakes looked silver in that veiled light, soft and peaceful. It struck her, as it often did on such nights, that the world could look very gentle from behind glass, Even when she knew there was hardship on every side, her boarders would be coming home soon, each from a different corner of the city, each with a different kind of weariness. She thought of Tom, the mechanic, with oil ingrained in the lines of his hands and the shoulders of his jacket. All day he bent over engines and gears in the chilly workshop, the smell of oil and steel in his lungs, the clatter of tools in his ears. She pictured him stepping into the boarding house hall, leaving his cap on the peg, grateful for the first touch of warmth on his chilled face. Then there was Miss Clara, so neat and precise, returning from the office where she transcribed letters all day, numbers and names marching across pages in clean, ordered lines. And Elsie, the seamstress, who carried her basket of mending like a small world in her arms, thread and cloth, her quiet companions. Lastly, Mr. Finch, with his careful, measured walk, the retired railway man who still rose early out of old habit, even with no trains to meet. Mrs. Harrow let the curtain fall back into place and turned away from the window. She could feel the idea that had been resting in her mind all day, as quiet and insistent as the falling snow, pushing again to the surface. Christmas was only a few nights away. The shops were already displaying their paper garlands, their tinsel, their modest gifts. On the street, she had heard children singing snatches of carols, their thin voices carried by the wind. Yet in this house, with its solitary boarders and its closed doors, Christmas might pass with only a nod and a sigh, a single extra candle, perhaps, and nothing more. She moved to straighten a cushion, smoothing its faded cover with a thoughtful hand. None of them had family close by. Not really. There were letters, of course, and far-off places called home. But no voices on the stair, no knock on the door that signaled a mother or brother or child arriving with parcels. The war in Europe had begun months ago, casting a long, uncertain shadow over the year. But even before that, distance and work and circumstance had held people apart. Her boarders were like ships in harbor, resting between journeys, but unmoored. It seemed wrong that Christmas, of all nights, should find them each alone in their rooms, eating whatever they had put aside, thinking their separate thoughts. So, as she had polished the hall table and folded the laundry and counted the coal, a small plan had formed, simple and steady. A supper, nothing grand, nothing to strain her purse or embarrass them with excess, but a shared table, a shared meal, and perhaps, if they were willing, shared stories. She could bake bread, make a pot of vegetable soup, roast a modest joint if the butcher's prices had not climbed too much. She had a jar of preserved apples in the pantry, laid up in the summer. She could make a pie. Between them, the boarders might contribute something small without being asked directly. A bit of jam, a few oranges, a tin of tea. It was the being together that mattered, more than what stood on the table. She pictured it now, standing in the quiet parlor as the fire settled into a deeper glow. The table pulled out to its full length, covered with the good cloth she saved for Sundays. Candles in the middle, their light soft and trembling, touching faces with a warm, gentle sheen. Outside, the snow would still be falling. Inside, the voices would be low and peaceful, talking of past winters, of gardens and rivers and small villages far from the smoke of this city. A Christmas supper for people with no family nearby, but with one another, just for that night. Her gaze drifted to the small clock on the mantel. The hands pointed towards 6. It would not be long now until the front door opened and the familiar footsteps began to climb the stairs. She decided she would speak of it this evening, while they sat by the fire, while the snow pressed its quiet face against the windows. She would tell them she wished to make a Christmas supper if they did not mind sharing it together. She would make it sound simple, almost casual, so they would not feel obliged. Yet in her heart, she hoped they would accept, that they would nod and smile and say yes. that they would allow a little warmth to gather around them like a soft, shared blanket. She left the parlor, the fire whispering behind her, and moved down the short passage to the kitchen. The air here was cooler, but there was a comfort in the familiar smell of flour and soap and coal dust. She checked the pantry, counting quietly: potatoes, onions, a small sack of carrots, a jar of pickled beets. The flour bin was not full, but there was enough for bread and perhaps a cake if she was careful. She touched the cool glass of the apple jar and imagined its contents bubbling in a pie, perfuming the house with sweetness and spice. All manageable, she thought, if she spread the cost and the work over the next few days. As she set a kettle on the stove for the evening tea, a gentle rhythm settled in her chest, calm and sure. Outside, the wind sighed softly along the brick walls, and the snow continued to fall, peaceful and unhurried. Somewhere high above the gray veil of clouds, the thin winter moon watched in silence, its silver light filtering down, resting on rooftops, chimneys, and the old boarding house on the narrow street. Within those walls, in the glow of lamps and the warmth of fire, a small intention had taken root, to turn one cold winter night into something gentle and shared. The house seemed to listen, its staircases and corridors waiting, as if it understood that Christmas, even in a hard year, might still bring a quiet, tender kind of magic. The clock struck the quarter hour with a soft, familiar chime. Mrs. Harrow wiped her hands on her apron and moved back toward the hall, ready to greet whoever came through the door first. The snow whispered against the windows. The lamps shone with a calm, golden light. The boarding house stood quietly in the deepening evening, a simple place in a gray city, wrapped now in snow, and the first faint promise of a gentle, peaceful Christmas supper. The first to come home that evening was Tom. The front door opened with a familiar, careful push, as if he still expected the stiff hinges that had squealed all autumn before he fixed them. A faint gust of cold air followed him into the hall, scented with snow and distant smoke, but it was quickly swallowed by the quieter scents of the house: coal dust, clean linen, a trace of soap from the freshly scrubbed floor. He stamped his boots gently on the mat, not wishing to bring in more slush than he must, and took off his flat cap, brushing a few melting flakes from its brim. For a moment, he stood still, letting the warmth touch his cheeks, the silence of the boarding house wrapping around him like a soft, familiar coat. He hung his cap on its usual peg and loosened the scarf at his throat. A faint sheen of oil still darkened his hands, despite his best efforts, at the wash basin in the workshop. Fine black shadows clung to the lines of his knuckles, to the half-moons of his nails, stubborn and thin. He looked at them with a small, resigned smile, then rubbed his palms again on his handkerchief, as if he might yet coax them clean before anyone saw. The echo of clanging metal and wheezing pipes still lingered in his ears, but the quiet hush of the hall was beginning to smooth them away. He could hear the faint ticking of the mantel clock in the parlor, steady and calm, like a slow, kind heart. "Good evening, Tom." Mrs. Harrow called gently from the doorway, her voice warm but not intrusive. She had the knack of greeting a man as if she had been expecting him at that exact moment, as if his arrival completed something that had been waiting, but she kept her tone soft, without making him feel examined. "Cold night," she added, glancing at the damp shoulders of his jacket. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, shifting his weight, his breath still faintly clouding the air. "Snow's settling now. Streets are going quiet." He hesitated, then asked, almost shyly, "Fire's on?" "In the parlor," she said, with a little nod toward the open door. "Go and warm yourself. I'll bring tea in a few minutes." He murmured thanks and moved toward the parlor, his boots sounding dull and gentle on the boards. When he stepped inside, the warmth met him like a slow, welcoming tide. The fire glowed red and orange in the grate, casting a soft light that stroked the worn armchairs and the small table set with a plain vase and a few evergreen twigs. Shadows gathered in the corners, but they were soft shadows, not sharp or unfriendly. Tom sat down in his usual chair by the fireplace, leaning forward to let the heat reach his chilled fingers. He held his hands out, oil darkened and rough, to the gentle light, and watched the fire move within the coals, quiet and steady. Not long after, the door opened again, and Miss Clara stepped into the hall, bringing with her the faint scent of cold paper and ink, as if the office had clung to her even out in the snow. She closed the door with care, pressing it until the latch caught, and stood a moment, smoothing the front of her coat with gloved hands. Snowflakes clung to the edges of her dark hat, tiny white petals on black felt, and a little strand of hair had escaped from the neat coil at the back of her head. She removed her gloves one finger at a time, precise and methodical even in this small task, then unpinned her hat and shook it lightly, sending a last soft dust of melting snow onto the mat. "Good evening, Miss Clara," Mrs. Harrow said, appearing once more as if she had been listening for that particular sound of the latch. "You're just in time to steal a little warmth from the fire before it goes all to Mr. Tom in there." Miss Clara's lips curved in the suggestion of a smile, the reserved yet genuine kind that seemed to belong to her alone. "Then I must hurry before he has it all," she replied gently. Her voice was low and clear, with the small, careful pronunciation of someone used to reading letters aloud. She slipped her hat onto the peg beside Tom's cap, arranged her scarf more neatly, and moved toward the parlor. When she entered, Tom rose halfway from his chair, an old, instinctive courtesy his mother had drilled into him before he ever saw a machine. She thanked him with a small inclination of her head and took the chair opposite the fire, smoothing her skirt to keep it from creasing. For a few moments they sat in a silence that was not unfriendly, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire and the faint whisper of the wind at the window. The snow outside had thickened. The light that filtered through the curtains was now soft and milky, like diluted moonlight. Elsie arrived next, her arms curled protectively around her work basket. The handle had left a pale line across the wool of her sleeve, and a few threads clung to her skirt like slender, colored spiderwebs. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her breath coming in small white puffs as she pushed the door shut with a gentle push of her hip. A few soft flakes clung to her lashes before melting into clear drops, making her eyes shine when she blinked. "Evening, Elsie." Mrs. Harrow greeted her with a kindness that had just a hint of motherliness, never enough to alarm the girl. "Long day?" Elsie's small smile was bright, but a little tired. "Only the usual, ma'am," she said. "Needles and thread and ladies' hems." She glanced down at her basket, then back up. "Is the fire on? My fingers feel like they've turned to glass." "Go and thaw them," Mrs. Harrow replied. "You'll find tea coming in shortly." Elsie obeyed gladly, slipping into the parlor with her basket hugged close. Her eyes adjusted to the gentler light there, and she felt tension she had not noticed begin to ease from her shoulders. Tom looked up and offered a quiet greeting. Miss Clara gave her a small nod, inviting without pressure. Elsie took a seat nearer the side of the fire, setting her basket down carefully at her feet, the familiar weight of it a comfort. She held her hands out toward the warmth, fingers spread, and watched as the red glow washed over her pale knuckles, making them almost luminous. The gentle crackle of the coals sounded to her like a friend's low, steady voice, always there, always calm. Last of all came Mr. Finch, moving more slowly on the snowy steps, testing each one as if he still expected them to sway like the platform at a busy station. He opened the door and closed it with a firm, practiced hand, as he might once have closed a carriage door, making sure of the latch. His overcoat was buttoned up to his chin, and his knitted scarf was wound neatly around his throat. He removed his hat, brushed the snow from its brim, and stood for a moment with his eyes closed, simply feeling the warmth of the hall on his face. listening to the ticking clock and the faint murmur of voices in the parlor. "Evening, Mr. Finch," Mrs. Harrow said, her tone almost a welcome and almost a question, as if she were asking how the day had been without pressing. He opened his eyes and smiled, the fine lines at their corners deepening. "Evening, ma'am," he replied. "The snow's doing its best to lay a new world over the old one, I think. Streets are very quiet, feels like a Sunday." His voice had a mild, musical quality, a trace of the countryside he had left behind many years before. "Well, we'll let the fire help with the new world," she answered. "They're all in there now. You'll be wanting your chair, I expect." "If it's not been claimed," he said, with a soft chuckle, though they both knew it never was. He made his way to the parlor, each step careful, his hand brushing the wall in a habit of balance. When he entered, the glow of the fire greeted him, and so did 3 pairs of eyes, each in their quiet way glad of his arrival. Tom shifted slightly to make room, as though there had not already been enough. Miss Clara inclined her head, and Elsie offered a shy little smile. Mr. Finch sat in the chair nearest the clock, where he could hear both its ticking and the fire's gentle murmur, an old man's simple pleasure. When they were all settled, the room felt fuller, not in a crowded way, but in a way that suggested a circle, a pattern completed. The firelight moved gently over their faces, softening angles, catching on a stray hair here, a small seam of tiredness there. Outside, the snow drifted down past the window, silver against the deepening sky, and the faint sound of the wind pressing along the street gave the room an added sense of safety. Within these walls, there was warmth. There were chairs to sit in. There was the promise of tea. Mrs. Harrow entered carrying a tray, the teapot steaming, the cups arranged in their familiar order. The scent of strong, simple tea floated ahead of her like a soft, reassuring cloud. She set the tray on the low table and began to pour, her movements practiced but never mechanical. Each cup was offered with a small word, a gentle phrase, the same each evening, and yet never tired. "There you are, Tom. For you, Miss Clara. Careful. It's hot, Elsie. Mr. Finch, I've left room for your sugar, as you like it." They drank in companionable quiet at first, hands wrapped around warm china, faces turned a little toward the fire. The peace of the moment settled over them, weaving them together in the simple act of sharing heat and light and a familiar drink. The city outside, with all its smoke and noise and uncertainty, seemed far away, as if the snow had built a soft wall between them and it, muffling every harsh sound. When the cups were half empty and the kettle had finished its faint, whispering hiss on the stove in the adjoining kitchen, Mrs. Harrow sat down in the straight-backed chair near the door, wiping her hands quietly on her apron. She looked at the 4 faces in the firelight, each marked by work, by distance, by private thoughts, and felt her small plan rise again, gentle and insistent. The moment felt right, with the snow drifting, the fire glowing, and their shoulders finally beginning to loosen. "If you'll forgive me a small interruption," she began, her voice calm and even. "I've been thinking about something for the last day or 2. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward her, attentive but not alarmed. She folded her hands loosely in her lap and continued, "Christmas is nearly upon us. I know we've all our own memories of it, and families in different places, but I did not like the thought of the day coming and going, with each of you in your own room, eating alone." Tom shifted slightly in his chair, staring into his cup, as if the thought mirrored something he had tried not to consider. Miss Clara's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her saucer. Elsie's eyes widened a little, searching Mrs. Harrow's face. Mr. Finch looked toward the mantel, where the clock ticked steadily. One more Christmas approaching in a long line. "I wondered," Mrs. Harrow went on, and her tone was almost apologetic, as if she were asking something for herself rather than offering something to them. whether you might be willing to share a simple Christmas supper together in the dining room. Nothing grand. I've a mind to bake some bread, make a good soup, perhaps a roast if the butcher is kind, and a pie from the apples I put up in summer. If you wished, each of you might bring something small to add. Mostly, I thought it would be kinder to sit together, just for that evening. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The fire sighed softly in the grate. The snow whispered at the glass. In that quiet, each of them saw, as if reflected, the vision of their own small room on Christmas night. The single plate, the single fork, the way sound fell flat against the walls when there was no one to answer a spoken thought. Then, almost at the same time, each of them saw another picture. The long table downstairs, the white cloth, the candles, the shared bowls and plates, the murmur of voices. Tom cleared his throat, a little awkwardly. I'd be grateful for that, ma'am, he said, his gaze fixed on the fire, as if the flames steadied him. Better than eating my supper on the edge of the bed, talking to the kettle. There was a small, quiet ripple of amusement around the room, gentle and understanding. I should like it very much, Miss Clara said next, her voice calm, but carrying a note of something softer beneath. I can bring a little tin of tea my sister sent in the autumn, the good kind, from the shop near the park. It seems more fitting to share it. She lifted her eyes briefly to the others, then let them fall again. But something eased in the set of her shoulders. I've got a jar of jam, Elsie added quickly, as if afraid she might be too late to offer anything. Blackberry. My grandmother made it before I came away. I've been saving it for something. Perhaps this is it. Her cheeks flushed, not from the fire this time, but from the feeling of giving a small treasure. Mr. Finch nodded slowly, the light from the flames reflecting in his thoughtful eyes. I've a tin of biscuits my nephew sent last month, he said. Too rich to eat alone, really. They'd sit better if shared. He smiled, a quiet, pleased smile, as if he had discovered a natural answer to a long, unasked question. Mrs. Harrow felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Then, it's settled, she said softly, so as not to disturb the gentle air that had arisen among them. We shall have our Christmas supper together. We'll make it simple and peaceful, a quiet celebration just for us. They sat for a time longer, speaking now in low, easy voices, the first shy barrier between them beginning to melt like snow on warm stone. Outside, the night deepened, and the hidden moon lent its pale silver glow to the sky, turning the falling flakes into soft, drifting stars. Within the boarding house, faces shone in the firelight, no longer quite so solitary, touched by the first, faint promise of a shared, gentle Christmas. In the days that followed their quiet agreement by the fire, a gentle expectancy settled over the boarding house. It was not a loud or bustling excitement, but something soft and steady, like a low, pleasant note held beneath ordinary sounds. The week's work went on as usual. The factory still called Tom each morning with its harsh whistle. The office still awaited Miss Clara's neat hands and clear eyes. The dressmaker's rooms still needed Elsie's fine stitching, and Mr. Finch still kept his small, comfortable routines. Yet under all of this, like a calm current beneath a river's surface, there flowed the shared knowledge that on Christmas evening they would not be alone. The thought accompanied them through dim workshops, chilly stairwells, and crowded streets, giving a faint glow to otherwise ordinary hours. On the morning of the supper, the snow had paused, as if the sky itself were resting. The city lay under a still, pale mantle, the rooftops smoothly rounded, the cobbles softened by packed white. The sky was a clear, delicate gray, and behind it, the hidden sun gave a faint silver light that made the frost on window panes sparkle. In the narrow street, few carts passed, their wheels crunching softly, their horses' breath rising in small clouds. The boarding house stood in quiet dignity, its brick walls streaked with old soot, but touched now at the edges with clean snow. A thin line of smoke rose straight from its chimney into the calm air, a sign of warmth within. Mrs. Harrow had been awake before dawn, listening to the gentle creaks of the sleeping house, the distant echo of a milk cart, the muffled tick of the clock downstairs. When she rose, the rooms still lay in shadow, but her mind was clear and orderly. There was bread to bake, vegetables to prepare, linens to check, a table to extend. She moved through her tasks with the composed grace of long practice, yet today there was a quiet brightness in her eyes. In the kitchen, she stirred the banked embers until they glowed, added fresh coal, and soon the stove began to hum with familiar heat. The kettle was set in its accustomed place, and a first pot of tea fortified her against the long, gentle labor of the day. She began with the bread, the heart of the meal: flour, salt, water, yeast. Simple things, yet when brought together with steady hands and patience, they became something nurturing and kind. She sifted the flour into a wide bowl, the fine white dust falling like tiny grains of snow. As she poured in the warm water and worked in the yeast, the mixture came together in a soft, yielding mass. Her hands moved with a calm, rhythmic motion, pressing and folding, until the dough grew smooth and elastic, alive under her palms. The kitchen filled with the quiet sound of her work, a soft, repeated whisper against the wooden table. When at last she covered the bowl with a clean cloth and set it near the stove, the dough sat like a small, hopeful promise, slowly rising in the gentle warmth. The vegetables came next. Potatoes were scrubbed and peeled, their pale surfaces shining in the light from the window. Carrots were trimmed and sliced into bright coins, onions chopped with quick, practiced strokes that brought a faint sting to her eyes. She brushed the tears away with the back of her hand, not minding them. Onions had always been that way. In the big pot, butter melted and murmured, accepting the vegetables as she dropped them in. The scent of onions softening, of carrots beginning to sweeten, rose up in a comforting wave. Soon the stock was added, rich and simple, and the soup began to simmer, its little bubbles rising and breaking in a peaceful, steady rhythm like tiny breaths. As she worked, the house slowly awakened to the day. Footsteps crossed, bedroom floors above, doors opened and closed, water splashed at basins. Tom went out early to finish a last half-day's work at the workshop, returning by noon with his collar turned up against the biting air, his cheeks reddened and eyes bright from the cold. Miss Clara had obtained leave for the day, a small courtesy from an employer who preferred not to heat the office on holidays, and she had spent the morning writing a few letters at her desk, the scratch of her pen keeping her company. Elsie had been occupied with a last bit of mending for a client, but her thoughts had wandered more than her needle, drifting again and again to the supper table that would be laid out tonight. Mr. Finch, with no duties to claim him, had taken a short walk to the corner shop after breakfast, his steps careful on the frosted pavement as he bought the small things he had decided would complete his offering. By early afternoon, Tom's quiet contribution was already underway. In the days since that first evening, he had noticed the way the dining room door still caught slightly when the weather was damp, how one of the window latches rattled whenever the wind pushed down the street. They were small things, but he could not bear the thought of a draft creeping over the supper table or a sudden squeak disturbing the peacefulness of their meal. So, after changing his clothes and washing as much of the workshop from his hands as water and soap would allow, he took his tools and set to work. The door was lifted gently from its hinges, the pins inspected and wiped clean, a thin trace of oil applied where the metal needed it. When he set it back in place, it moved smoothly, closing with a soft, contented click. At the window, the loose latch was tightened, the frame inspected, a little strip of cloth tucked into a gap to keep out any inquisitive draft. Tom stood for a moment, looking out at the pale, still street, the snow-banked edges of the pavement, the fragile lace of frost along the railings. The sky had softened further, and a faint pearly glow at the horizon hinted that the low winter sun was turning in its slow arc. He imagined how the view would look later, when the light faded and the first star appeared, and felt a quiet gladness that the room would be warmer for those who sat within it. In the parlor, Miss Clara sat with her sewing basket open on her lap, though she was not doing her own work. The white tablecloth, brought out from the press and shaken gently until its creases softened, lay folded beside her. There was a small tear near one edge, the result of a careless catch on a chair leg long ago. It had been mended once, but roughly, and today, with a kind of quiet ceremony, she unpicked the old, clumsy stitches and laid in new ones. Her needle moved in small, even steps, drawing the parted threads together in a neat and unobtrusive seam. It was not important in itself, perhaps, but she liked the thought of the table being covered by something that had been carefully, thoughtfully restored, rather than merely patched. As she sewed, she thought of the letters she had written that morning, words sent across distance, and how this supper was, in its own way, a letter too, written not in ink, but in bread and soup and flickering candlelight. Elsie, with her quick, light hands, took charge of the decorations. There were no grand garlands, no glittering ornaments, but she had a good eye and a tender respect for small things. From a nearby greengrocer, she had bought a few sprigs of evergreen, their needles deep green and fragrant, and a handful of bright berries. With bits of ribbon saved from parcels and a little imagination, she began to transform the plain dining room. Along the mantel, she laid the evergreen boughs, letting them curve naturally, their tips overlapping. In places she tucked in the berries, tiny drops of color among the dark needles. The room filled with the clean forest scent of pine, a quiet echo of woods and hills far from the smoky city. On the table, she placed a simple glass jar in the center and filled it with water. Into this, she set a small gathering of greenery and one single pale winter rose she had found at the florist, its petals slightly bruised, but still faintly luminous. It seemed to her like a little moon, floating gently on a dark sea of leaves. Around it, she arranged 4 plain candles, their white sides smooth and waiting. She did not light them yet. That would come later, when the light fell and the sky deepened. But she imagined the moment when flame would touch wick, and the table would be framed by soft, golden halos, each face gently illuminated. Mr. Finch, when he came in from his errand, paused at the threshold of the dining room to take in the changes. The extended table, the white cloth, the evergreen along the mantel, the waiting candles, all of it together gave the room a quiet, expectant dignity. He nodded once, as if in approval of a well-kept timetable, then stepped forward to place his own contribution in its appointed place. The tin of biscuits, polished lid catching the pale afternoon light, went near the far end of the table, ready to be opened after the main dishes were done. From an inner pocket, he took his pocket watch, opened it briefly to check the time, then closed it with a soft click, the engraved star inside hidden again against its own gentle ticking. By late afternoon, the house was full of comforting sounds. The bread, having risen into soft, rounded loaves, was placed in the oven, and soon its warm, yeasty scent drifted through the rooms, mingling with the richer aroma of roasting meat. The soup thickened and deepened in flavor, its surface quivering lazily in the pot. In the kitchen, the clink of plates and cutlery being arranged, the faint ring of glassware set upon the sideboard, created a delicate music. Upstairs, the occasional creak of a board marked a footstep, a drawer being closed, a small preparation for evening. The day drew in, the light outside fading from silver to a softer, colder gray. and the first hint of night began to gather along the edges of the sky. As the last tasks were completed, a peaceful hush fell over the house, like the pause between the drawing of breath and the beginning of a gentle song. In the dining room, the table waited, its cloth smooth, its places set with simple, well-polished plates and knives and forks. The evergreen on the mantel rested in its quiet curve. The small winter rose stood serenely in its jar, and the candles waited, slender and still. Outside the windows, the sky deepened toward blue, and in the distance, beyond the roofs and chimneys, the first star trembled into view, a tiny point of silver in the soft dusk. When at last Mrs. Harrow took a match to the candles, one by one, tiny flames sprang up, bright and delicate, then steadied into calm, golden points. Their light touched the glass, the polished cutlery, the edges of plates, and spread outward, softening every line it encountered. The room seemed to exhale, becoming at once more intimate and more spacious, as if these 4 small flames had called forth a quiet, invisible presence of warmth and welcome. In the doorway, in the corridor, on the stair, the glow of the dining room spilled like a gentle promise, inviting each boarder to step out of solitude and into the shared light of this simple Christmas supper, laid with care in the heart of a quiet, snow-wrapped house. By the time the church bells in the distance chimed 6 slow notes into the frosty air, the boarding house was wrapped in a quiet, expectant calm. The sky outside the dining room windows had deepened to a soft, velvety blue, and the first silver edge of the moon was beginning to show above the rooftops. The snow, which had rested still through the day, now drifted again in delicate veils, almost too fine to see except where it passed across the face of the lamplight. In the narrow street, footsteps were rare, wheels rarer still. The city seemed to be pausing, as if taking a slow, gentle breath before the night of Christmas settled fully over it. Inside the house, warmth lay like a soft blanket along the corridors. The scent of baking bread and slow-cooked soup lingered on the air, mingled with the faint resin smell of the evergreen along the mantel. Lamps had been lit on each landing, their glow subdued but steady, guiding the boarders down toward the dining room. On the table, the candles burned in calm, golden pillars, their flames barely trembling in the quiet air. The silverware caught their light in small, peaceful flashes, while the winter rose in its glass jar seemed to float in a pale dream of reflections. Everything was ready, everything rested, waiting only for the people for whom all this quiet care had been taken. Tom stood on the landing outside his room for a moment, smoothing his hair with damp fingers. He had done what he could with his hands, scrubbing them again and again until the skin felt tight, though the faint shadows of oil still lingered in the lines. His shirt was freshly laundered, the collar a little stiff against his neck, and he had brushed his jacket as best he could to rid it of the fine dust of the workshop. In the small mirror above his washstand, his own face looked back at him, unfamiliar in its tidiness, the often smudged forehead now clear, the eyes seeming strangely bright. He felt a quiet flutter in his chest, not quite nervousness, but something close. He was more used to the clamor of engines and tools than to shared tables and candlelight. He descended the stairs slowly, his hand resting lightly on the smooth rail, polished by many years of use. As he approached the dining room, the soft radiance of the candles reached him first, along with the murmur of the fire in the nearby parlor, and the faint, comforting clink of dishes being moved. When he stepped through the doorway, he paused, surprised for a moment by the transformation. The room he had known as plain and serviceable seemed touched now by a kind of gentle enchantment. The white cloth lay smooth and quiet. The evergreens along the mantel cast delicate shadows on the wall, and the candles turned the air to a golden haze. Mrs. Harrow looked up from the sideboard where she was placing the last of the dishes. "You're early, Tom," she said, with a small, approving smile. "That's a good sign for a hungry man." He returned the smile, a little shyly. "Didn't see much sense in sitting upstairs alone," he answered. "Smell of the bread would only torment me." His eyes moved to the loaves, standing round and brown on the cutting board, their crusts catching the light. Beside them rested the roast, modest but carefully prepared, the surface crisp and glistening slightly, surrounded by patiently roasted potatoes and carrots. To one side sat the soup tureen, covered, but with a faint mist of steam curling from its edges. It all seemed very simple, yet in its simplicity, there was something deeply kind. Miss Clara arrived next, her steps precise but unhurried. She wore her best dark dress, the one she kept carefully for Sundays and special occasions, and at her collar she had pinned a small brooch shaped like a leaf. The silver of it caught the candlelight as she moved, a quiet gleam against the dark cloth. In her hands she carried a small, carefully wrapped parcel. She set it on the sideboard near the teapot and turned to take in the room, her expression softening almost imperceptibly as her eyes traced the curve of evergreens, the waiting plates, the gently burning candles. "It looks very beautiful," she said quietly to Mrs. Harrow. "Peaceful, like a place in a story." "That's what I was hoping for," the landlady replied. "Only a small story, but a peaceful one." Her gaze moved fondly around the room. "We shall call it the Christmas supper, and we shall all be in it, whether we like it or not." Elsie came soon after, her light footsteps quick but careful, as if she feared to disturb the stillness that had settled over the house. She had tied a pale ribbon in her hair, the only ornament she owned besides a thin silver ring she did not wear for fear of losing it at work. In her hands, she carried a little jar wrapped in a clean cloth, the blackberry jam, dark and shining beneath the glass. She placed it beside the biscuits Mr. Finch had brought earlier, then stepped back to look. The simple array of gifts on the sideboard moved her in a way she could not quite name. There was something gentle and tender in the sight of these modest treasures, saved and shared. Mr. Finch entered last, walking with his usual careful dignity. He had polished his shoes until they shone softly and brushed his coat until the nap lay smooth. His white shirt collar, though a little frayed at the edges, was clean and well pressed. In his hand, he held his pocket watch, turning it over once before slipping it back into his waistcoat with a small, satisfied motion, as if he were aligning time itself with the quiet order of the room. He greeted the others with a courteous inclination of his head, his eyes lingering in appreciation on the candles, the evergreens, the carefully laid table. When they were all gathered, the room seemed to grow more complete, as if each presence filled a space that had been waiting for it. Mrs. Harrow, her cheeks faintly flushed from the warmth of the kitchen, gestured gently toward the chairs. "If you please," she said, "take your places. There's no high or low at this table tonight. Sit where you feel at ease." After a slight, polite hesitation, they obeyed. Tom took the place nearest the end where the roast lay, without quite realizing that he had chosen the carver's position. Miss Clara sat to his left, her hands folding neatly in her lap, her eyes resting on the candles with a contemplative calm. Elsie took the chair opposite her, close enough to the winter rose that its pale petals brushed the edge of her vision. Mr. Finch settled at the far side, from where he could see both the table and, through the open doorway, a sliver of the parlor's hearth, its faint glow echoing the candle's light. For a moment, they sat quietly, their faces touched by the golden softness of the flames. The world outside the windows was a gentle darkness, broken only by the slow fall of snow and the distant, silvery glint of the rising moon. The house held them like a kind, protective shell, the walls sheltering this little pocket of warmth and light. "Tom," said Mrs. Harrow at last, her voice calm and practical, though there was a hint of ceremony in the way she spoke, "would you do us the honor of carving? He started slightly, looking from her to the waiting roast, then back again. "Me, ma'am?" he asked, uncertain. "I'm more used to turning bolts than carving meat, and I expect you handle a blade better than you think," she replied gently. "You've a steady hand. That's what's needed." There was no insistence in her tone, only quiet confidence, and something in that steadiness eased his doubts. "Very well," he said softly, rising and taking the carving knife she offered. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and found that his grip was indeed steady, just as it was when he guided a stubborn piece of metal into place. As he began to slice, the room filled with the soft sounds of the knife moving through the tender meat and the quiet clink of serving spoons against the dish. He took care to cut each portion neatly, his concentration lending the task a kind of dignity. When he passed the first plate to Mrs. Harrow, he did so with a careful, almost reverent gesture, as if he were passing along not just food, but something of himself. Once everyone was served and the soup was ladled into shallow bowls, a calm, grateful silence fell as they began to eat. The soup was simple and warming, the bread soft within and crisp without, the roast and vegetables comforting in their hearty, homely way. The candles burned steadily, their wax pooling slowly in gentle, rounded shapes. Outside, the wind moved quietly down the street, stirring the snow into soft, swirling eddies that brushed a faint, whispering sound against the window panes. The world beyond seemed far away, like a dream from which they had been gently set aside for a while. It was after the first quiet hunger had been eased, when plates were less full and movements less hurried, that Mrs. Harrow's earlier hope began to unfold. She glanced toward Tom, whose shoulders had relaxed, whose face looked almost peaceful in the mingled light of candles and hearth. "This is a good supper," she said softly, "and I'm glad we share it. It puts me in mind of how much a table can hold, beside plates and cups." Her eyes twinkled just a little as she turned to him. "Tom, you've carved for us like a proper host. It seems only fair you should be the first to speak of Christmases past. If you wish to, that is. No one is obliged." He looked at her, then at the others, and felt that small flutter in his chest again. Yet there was something in their faces, in their gentle, listening attention, that made the words ease themselves forward. He set down his fork, wiped his fingers carefully on his napkin, and stared for a moment at the candle nearest him, watching its flame dance in a soft, steady line. "Well," he began slowly, his voice a little rough from disuse in such settings. "There's not much to tell, truly. I grew up in a small place, not like this city, a village, with a mill and a bit of river, 2 younger brothers, always underfoot." As he spoke the word river, something in his expression softened, and his eyes lost their focus on the candle, looking somewhere far away instead. Christmas there was never grand, but it was full of noise and small things. He paused, letting the memory settle, then continued, his voice taking on a quieter, more rhythmic tone, as if he were following the gentle current of his thoughts. The river ran close by the mill. In summer, the water was bright and quick, full of light. My brothers and I would sit on the bank with lines we'd made ourselves, watching the tip of each rod for the smallest twitch. There were willow trees that leaned over the water, their long branches trailing like soft fingers. On hot days, we'd lie in their shade and watch the way the sunlight slipped through the leaves, all broken into little golden pieces on the water. It was peaceful there, very quiet, except for the gentle sound of the water and the turning of the mill wheel. He glanced around the table, as if half apologizing for the simplicity of his memories, but he saw only calm, attentive faces. Elsie's eyes were wide and soft, as if she could see the willows. Miss Clara sat very still, her hands folded, her gaze lowered, as though she were carefully placing his words among her own recollections. Mr. Finch nodded once, slowly, in understanding. In winter, Tom went on, his voice becoming more even, the river moved slower. Sometimes, near the banks, a thin skin of ice would form, and the wheel of the mill would turn more deliberately, as if it were tired and cold too. On Christmas Eve, my mother would send me and my brothers out to fetch a basket of wood from the shed. We'd race each other, our boots crunching on the frosted ground, our breath like little clouds. When we came back, the house would smell of baking and spice, and the windows would glow against the early dark. It was a small house, but it felt large enough for us all. Safe and soft and warm. His voice grew quieter still as he spoke, and the room seemed to lean in toward him, the candle flames flickering as if listening. We'd sit around the table, my father at one end, my mother at the other, my brothers jostling each other. There'd be a fire in the grate, not unlike the one in the parlor here, and outside, the wind would move through the bare branches by the river. Sometimes, if I listened very hard, I could hear the water under the ice, moving gently, never quite asleep. It had a peaceful sound. I used to think it whispered dreams to the trees, so they wouldn't feel lonely, standing there without their leaves. He stopped and gave a small, self-conscious laugh, as if he had said more than he intended. It's all very ordinary, I suppose. But that's what comes to mind when I think of Christmas. Not presents or grand things, just that little house and the river and my brothers' faces across the table. There was a silence then, but it was a full, tender silence, not an empty one. In it, each of them saw, as if painted with soft strokes of light, the picture he had drawn. The mill by the slow winter river, the willow branches bare and graceful against the sky, the small house with its windows glowing, a family gathered around a plain table. The harsh lines of the city fell away for a moment, replaced by fields rimed with frost and a path leading down to the water's quiet edge. You said, brothers, Elsie ventured softly, after a time. Are they still there? At the river, I mean? Tom's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass for a breath, and then eased. Aye, he answered. As far as I know. They're both grown now, mind you. One helps at the mill, the other works on a farm not far off. I haven't seen them in some time. Work keeps me here. Money's better in the city, you understand. But I like to think of them still walking that path to the river, still listening to the water in winter, still sitting down to supper at my mother's table. He looked down at his plate for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming steadier and somehow softer, like the water under ice. If I have a wish this Christmas, he said, it's a quiet one. I don't wish to be somewhere grand or to have more than I've got. I only wish that, wherever they are tonight, they're sitting in some warm room, not alone, that they've bread and perhaps a bit of roast and someone to talk to by the fire. And I suppose, he added, with a small, almost embarrassed smile, I wish they knew I'm all right here, that I've a table to sit at and people to share it with, so they don't need to picture me in some cold, dark corner of the city. The wish hung in the air, gentle and unforced, like a soft feather settling on a still surface. No one hurried to break the silence that followed. Each of them felt the quiet depth of it, not only for Tom and his brothers, but for themselves and for those they loved at a distance. Miss Clara's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. She simply inclined her head, as if in agreement with something deeper than words. Elsie blinked quickly, the candlelight catching a sudden shimmer at the corner of her eye. Mr. Finch drew in a slow breath, as if the memory of old winter journeys and distant stations had been stirred within him. Outside, the wind moved softly along the street, brushing against the windows with a low, continuous murmur. To Tom, sitting there with his plate before him and the candlelight soft on the faces around him, the sound was suddenly unmistakably like the river of his boyhood, gentle, patient, flowing in darkness while houses slept along its banks. It seemed to him that beneath the city's stone and brick, some deep silver stream ran on, carrying his quiet wish with it, far away to fields and mills and a little house where the windows glowed against the night. The boarding house, wrapped in snow and silence, held its breath around them, peaceful and still, as if listening too to the soft, unseen water that never ceased its tender dreaming song. For a little while after Tom finished speaking, the room remained very quiet. The only sounds were the soft settling of cutlery on plates, the muted crackle of the fire in the parlor beyond, and the low, steady whisper of the wind outside. The candles burned with a gentle brightness that seemed almost thoughtful, as if they too were considering the picture he had drawn of the river and the willow trees and the warm, crowded table in the little mill house. The snow at the window pressed close in a fine silver veil, and the faint glimmer of the rising moon gave the pane a soft, pale sheen. It was a peaceful silence, filled not with emptiness, but with shared reflection. Miss Clara had listened to Tom's story with her eyes cast slightly down, as if she were watching the words fall one by one upon a page only she could see. Now, as the pause lengthened, she lifted her gaze, letting it move slowly around the table. She saw Tom's face, a little softer than before. The tension in his jaw eased. She saw Elsie, who sat very still, her fingers curved lightly around the stem of her glass, as if afraid to disturb the quiet. She saw Mr. Finch, whose eyes had taken on that faraway look that meant he was hearing something beyond the room. Then her gaze met Mrs. Harrow's, and in that steady, kind look, she recognized an unspoken invitation. "If you would like to add something, Miss Clara," said Mrs. Harrow gently, "we would be glad to hear it. You have given so many others their words. Perhaps it is your turn." There was no pressure in her tone, only a calm, reassuring warmth, like a hand resting lightly on one's shoulder. Miss Clara gave the smallest of smiles, a slight curve of the mouth that might easily have been missed if one were not watching carefully. She set her fork down with quiet precision, straightened the edge of her napkin, and folded her hands together for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. When she began to speak, her voice was low and even, but there was a softness in it that had not been quite as audible before. "Well," she said, "Tom's River has reminded me that my own Christmases have always been full of letters, ink, and paper, as you might expect from someone who spends her days in an office." Her lips quirked faintly, acknowledging the small, dry joke. But before the office, there was my mother's little drawing room and the writing desk by the window. She looked past them for a moment, as if through a pane of glass far clearer than the one that looked out on the snowy street. "We lived in a small house on the edge of town," she went on. "Not in the country, quite, but close enough that there were gardens and trees and a little lane that led to fields. My mother kept a narrow strip of garden behind the house, nothing grand, but she loved it. She planted lilacs by the back wall, and in spring, the whole air would be sweet, as if the sky itself had remembered something gentle. I used to sit at the writing desk by the window and watch the branches move in the breeze while she worked outside with her gloves and her trowel. As she spoke of the garden, her voice settled into a slow, almost musical rhythm, like the steady line of handwriting drawn across a clean page. At Christmas, she continued, the garden was bare, of course. The lilac branches were dark and empty, the earth asleep under frost, but there was always one small evergreen shrub that refused to look bleak. Its leaves stayed glossy and green, even when the world was gray. I liked to imagine it was keeping watch over everything else, promising that the blossoms would return. That little patch of green, seen through the frosted glass, always made the winter feel less hard. She paused, and in that pause, The image seemed to settle into the room. The narrow garden, the bare branches, the quiet evergreen standing sentinel in the cold, and a girl at a desk with a pen in her hand. The candles flickered as if in agreement, and a faint shimmer of light moved across the white tablecloth like the memory of sunlight across a page. "My mother played the piano in the evenings," Miss Clara said softly. "Not professionally, of course. She had learned as a girl, and she played for her own pleasure. On winter nights, when the windows were white with frost and the lamps were lit, she would sit at the old upright in the front room and play simple pieces, hymns and carols, and small, delicate tunes that sounded like falling snow. I would sit at the desk in the back room, near the garden window, and write letters while listening. The sound came to me through the walls, softened and distant, like music heard across water. It made writing feel peaceful, like tracing words in moonlight." Her eyes lowered again, not in shyness this time, but in recollection. "We wrote many letters, my mother and I. My father had relatives in the north, near the coast, and there were cousins and aunts scattered here and there. At Christmas, there would be a flurry of envelopes on the hall table, and we would sit together to answer them, her dictating and me writing, or sometimes each of us composing our own. I learned the shapes of the words before I truly understood all their weight. My dear, with fond love, may this letter find you in health." All the little phrases that try, in their limited way, to carry warmth from one home to another. She glanced briefly at Tom, then at Elsie and Mr. Finch, as if to include them in the circle of those distant correspondents. "When my mother fell ill," she said, her voice very quiet, "the letters changed. They became fewer, slower. I wrote them all then. I wrote to tell people that she could not reply herself, that she was resting, that we thanked them for their prayers. I tried to make the words gentle and calm because I did not want anyone far away to imagine anything harsh. I thought if I wrote in a soft, steady way, then everything would feel softer and steadier, even at a distance." The room held its breath around her. There was no sharpness in her tone, no bitterness, only a deep, calm tenderness, like a hand smoothing a coverlet. "After she was gone," Miss Clara went on, "the letters from relatives became fewer still. People are kind for a time, then life takes them back up in its hands. That is natural. But the habit of writing was in me by then. It had become a kind of thread running through my days. When I came to this city and found work, first as a housemaid, then as a clerk, and finally as a secretary in the office where I am now, I found that the sound of a pen on paper still comforted me." She gave a small, self-conscious smile. "In the building where I lodge during the week," she said, "there are 2 elderly ladies in rooms below mine. They never married. One has a son abroad in the Navy, the other a niece somewhere in Canada. Neither can hold a pen steadily anymore, and their eyes are not what they were. So, in the evenings, I go down to them, and they dictate letters, and I write. One likes to tell her son about the weather. She describes the rain and the wind and the way the light falls on the roofs, as if these things might cross the sea and touch his face. The other writes to her niece about small domestic things, a new teacup, a patch of blue sky, a robin she saw in the yard. It is all so very ordinary, and yet when she speaks of the robin, her voice sounds quite young. She reached down, almost absently, to the handbag that hung from the back of her chair. From it, she drew a small bundle of envelopes, tied neatly with a blue ribbon. The paper had been carefully folded and refolded until the edges were faintly curved. She laid the bundle on the table near her plate, beside her hand, the ribbon catching a glint of candlelight. "These," she said, with a faint hint of embarrassment, "are my own letters. They are not addressed to anyone in particular. I write them to home, though I have no precise place in mind. I suppose I mean the place where things feel whole, where the garden is always just beyond the window, and the piano is playing softly, and there is someone in the next room who will be glad to know how the day has passed. She gave a small, half-amused shrug. I have never posted them. It seemed enough, somehow, that they exist. Elsie leaned forward a little, her eyes shining. Do you write about the lilacs? She asked, in a hushed voice, as if afraid to startle the moment. Sometimes, Miss Clara answered. And sometimes I write about the office, or the people in the street, or the color of the sky at sunset. But more often, I write about small, quiet things. The way the frost looked on the window this morning, like silver ferns. The way the moonlight fell on the opposite roof last week, turning the snow there to a sheet of pale, soft light. I try to put into words the gentle parts of the day, the ones that might be overlooked. It comforts me to think that somewhere, even if only in imagination, there's a room where those words are read by someone who understands. There was a pause. Then Mr. Finch said, very softly, Would you read us a little, Miss Clara? If you would not mind, just a line or two. I think it might be good for the house to hear such a letter on a night like this. She hesitated, looking down at the bundle as if it were a private garden gate she was not sure she should open. But the faces around her were so calm, so gently expectant, that her reluctance melted like frost in sunlight. With careful fingers, she untied the blue ribbon and selected one envelope from the middle of the stack. The paper inside had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink was clear. She unfolded it with the reverence of someone handling something both fragile and durable at once. Her voice, when she began to read, was very soft, almost like the voice she used for her elderly neighbors, but clearer, steadier. Dearest home, she read. Tonight the air smells faintly of coal smoke and distant rain, but if I close my eyes, I can imagine the scent of lilacs drifting in from the garden. The sky over the city is a soft, clouded gray, but there is one bright opening through which a single star is shining, very small and very white. I like to think that somewhere beyond that light, there is a place where the lamps are already lit and the piano is waiting to be played. I imagine walking through the door and knowing, before I hang up my coat, that my chair is ready by the fire. She paused, eyes skimming down the page, then chose another passage. Today, at the office, she read. I watched the sunlight slide slowly across the floor from one end of the room to the other as the morning became afternoon. The dust motes in the beam of light looked like tiny floating seeds drifting in a warm, still stream. For a moment, everything felt quiet and suspended, as if the world had decided to rest. I wished, then, that I could send that peaceful moment to you in this letter, sealed between the pages like a pressed flower, so that you might open it on a hard day and feel, for a little while, as if you too were sitting in that calm, golden light. She folded the paper again, her fingers lingering on the edges for a breath before she slipped it back into its envelope. When she looked up, the room seemed softer somehow. The faces around the table were thoughtful, and the candle flames appeared to burn more gently, as if hushed by the quiet music of her words. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the snow fell straight and slow, a steady veil of pale, silent grace under the silvering sky. There is nothing very important in any of them, Miss Clara said, almost apologetically. They are only little records of days, of small, gentle things. But when I write them, I feel less alone, as if I were sending part of myself out into the world, and that somewhere, the world is kind enough to receive it. Tom shifted slightly in his chair. Sounds important enough to me, he said quietly. If there were more letters like that in the world, maybe it'd feel a bit softer round the edges. Elsie nodded, her fingers unconsciously tracing the curve of the blue ribbon still lying on the table. It's like you sew the day together with words, she murmured. so it doesn't fall apart when you look back at it. Mr. Finch smiled, a deep, gentle smile that reached his eyes. You've been riding home all along, he said. Only tonight, it seems, home has decided to come and sit at this table with you. A calm settled over them then, deeper even than before. It was as if the unseen distance between their separate lives had drawn a little closer, filled not only with memories of rivers and gardens and pianos, but with the soft, silver thread of words sent into the world and received, for this moment, by kind listeners. The house seemed to listen too, its old walls holding the sound of Miss Clara's voice as tenderly as they held the warmth from the stove and the glow from the lamps. Somewhere beyond the roofs, the moon rose higher, brightening the snow, and the stars multiplied quietly in the darkening sky, like unwritten letters scattered across a vast, peaceful page. After Miss Clara folded her letter and tied the blue ribbon once more around the little bundle, the room seemed to rest for a moment in a soft, contemplative quiet. The candles burned low and steady, their flames slender and serene, casting a golden haze that made every edge gentler, every shadow softer. Outside, the snow fell in slow, straight lines, a fine, white curtain across the darkened street. The moon had risen higher now, and its pale light lay over the city roofs like a thin, silver veil, mingling with the lamplight so that the world beyond the windows looked distant and slightly softened, as if seen through remembered tears. Within the dining room, the air felt warm and still, filled with the lingering music of Tom's River and Miss Clara's letters, each story settling around the table like a quiet, protective shawl. Elsie sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, the edge of her napkin still between her fingers, her cheeks faintly pink from the glow of attention that had momentarily passed over her when Miss Clara read. She had listened so closely that her whole body seemed to lean towards the sound, her eyes following each word as if it were being stitched into the air. Now, as silence returned, she glanced down at the basket by her chair, where the familiar curve of her spool of thread sat just visible beneath a folded cloth. A little flutter moved through her, something like the sensation she felt when she tugged the last stitch of a seam and knew, with relief and quiet pride, that it would hold. She sensed, though no one had yet spoken her name, that it might soon be her turn. Mrs. Harrow, who had been watching them all with that attentive gentleness that missed very little, turned her gaze towards Elsie. "We have heard about rivers and gardens and letters," she said softly, her voice as warm and even as the fire in the parlor. "It seems to me that a supper table is not complete without something sewn into it, even if only in words. Elsie, my dear, if you feel able, perhaps you might tell us a little of your home. You mentioned before a grandmother who spoke of a silver thread. I have been thinking of that ever since." Elsie's fingers tightened briefly around the napkin, then loosened. "Oh," she murmured, looking down with a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sure my stories are very simple, ma'am, not like Miss Clara's letters or Mr. Tom's River." She hesitated, then glanced up, meeting the gentle expectancy in the faces around her. There was no pressing, only quiet invitation. "But I can try," she added, her voice low and musical, like a lullaby half remembered. Her eyes moved to the nearest candle, watching the thin flame lean and straighten in the faint currents of warm air. "I was born in a little village," she began, "far from the city. It lay in a shallow valley, with fields running up the sides of the hills and a small stream at the bottom, so clear you could see the pebbles, even when the sky was gray. In summer, the banks were crowded with wildflowers, daisies and buttercups, and little blue ones whose names I never knew. The hills rose gently around us, like cupped hands, and at night, if you lay on your back in the grass, you could see so many stars that it seemed someone had spilled a box of silver beads across a dark cloth." As she spoke, Her voice steadied, and the pictures she carried inside her began to pour out in an easy, unhurried flow. My grandmother's cottage was at the very edge of the village, she continued, where the last garden gave way to a small patch of scrub and then the open hillside. It was a low house with a thatched roof and 2 small windows facing east. In the mornings, the first light would spill through those windows and pool on the flagstone floor, pale and soft, like milk. She had a little garden of her own, not as orderly as some, but full of herbs and green things, mint and rosemary and sage, a row of beans, a patch of violets under the hedge, and one old rose bush that still managed a few pale blooms each year, as if it wanted to remember its younger days. She smiled at the memory, her eyes brightening. In the evenings, especially in winter, we would sit by the hearth. The fire was never very large, but it was steady, a small, glowing heart at the center of the room. My grandmother had her sewing basket at her feet and her spectacles low on her nose. I remember the way the firelight touched her needle, catching on it as it moved in and out of the cloth like a little star going back and forth. Sometimes the wind would slip under the door and wander around the room, but the fire and the lamplight and her quiet humming made it feel very safe and peaceful. It was then that her expression turned more thoughtful and her voice grew softer, almost reverent. She used to say, Elsie went on, that every person carries a silver thread inside them, not a thread you can see or touch, but one that runs from heart to heart, tying us to the people we love. You may walk far away, she told me once, when we were mending a sheet together by lamplight. You may cross fields and cities and seas, but that thread will not break. It might stretch, it might tangle a little, but it will still be there, shining like moonlight in the dark. I used to picture it, a glowing thread running between all the cottages in the village, and then out into the world, and then up into the sky where the stars are, as if the whole world were stitched together with a very fine, very gentle hand. Her hand moved almost unconsciously to the basket by her chair. With careful fingers, she drew out a small spool of thread and held it up near the candlelight. It was not ordinary thread. Even in the soft glow of the dining room, it seemed to carry its own faint sheen, a pale, shifting glimmer that made it look almost silver, though not truly metallic. The others leaned forward a little, watching the way it caught the light, its slender surface reflecting the flame in tiny, delicate flashes. My grandmother gave me this, Elsie explained, cradling the spool in her palm as if it were something delicate and precious. On the day I left the village to come here, she pressed it into my hand at the gate. She said it wasn't really magic, not in the way of tales, but that sometimes a thing can help you remember what you already know. This is to remind you, she said, that the silver thread is real. Even if you cannot see it, when you feel lonely, take it out and look at it, and think of all the hearts it ties you to. She told me I was to use it only for special stitches, and only when my heart felt very quiet and very kind. Elsie turned the spool slowly between her fingers, watching the thread's pale shine turn and dim and shine again. When I first came to the city, she continued, everything felt so loud and smoky and hard. The streets were full of clatter, the buildings so tall they hid half the sky, and the air smelled of coal and iron instead of earth and grass. I missed the hills and the stream and the little stars we used to watch between the cottage roofs. In the workroom where I was apprenticed, the light was good, but it was all from high windows, and the sewing tables were crowded with cloth and hands and needles. I felt very small. At night, in my narrow bed, I would take out this spool and hold it up to the window, and when the moon was out, the thread would catch the silver light and glimmer just a little, as if it were remembering the stars for me. She paused, her eyes unfocused for a moment, seeing some long ago night beyond the boarding house walls. It was then I began to sew the stars," she said quietly. "At the dressmaker's, we made fine garments for ladies I rarely saw, velvet and silk and lace, fabrics soft as petals and heavy as water. Most of the stitches were practical seams and hems and darts and buttonholes. But sometimes, when I finished a piece for someone who looked especially tired or sad, I would add a very small, secret stitch near the hem, right where no one would notice. 5 tiny points, hardly visible, made with this thread, a little star tucked into the folds, her lips curved in an almost shy smile, as if she were confessing a small, harmless mischief. I told myself," she went on, "that if the silver thread truly carried something of the heart, then perhaps a star sewn with it might carry a wish. Not a grand wish, nothing that would change the world. Only a wish for gentle dreams, for a softer night, for a feeling of being watched over. I never spoke of it to anyone. It was just a quiet habit, like saying a prayer without words. When I stitched that little star, I would think, 'May this wearer sleep in peace. May the night be kind. May their heart remember its silver thread.'" The others listened with a kind of tender fascination. Tom's rough hands rested loosely on the table now, relaxed, his eyes fixed on the spool of shimmering thread. Miss Clara's lips were slightly parted, as if she were silently repeating the shape of those tiny star stitches in her mind. Mr. Finch looked down for a moment at the cuff of his own sleeve, as though considering what secrets cloth might hold. "Did you ever know," asked Miss Clara softly, "if your stars worked? If anyone slept more peacefully because of them?" Elsie tilted her head, thinking. "I cannot be sure," she said. "They were so small, and the people who wore the dresses never knew I had put them there. But once, there was a lady who often came in for fittings. She was very pale, with eyes that looked as if they had seen too much worry. She seemed always on the verge of shivering, even when the room was warm. One day, as I knelt to check the hem of her gown, I felt such a sudden wave of pity that I could hardly see the stitches for a moment. When the mistress left the room to fetch something, I took out this thread and made the smallest star right at the back of the skirt where it brushed the floor. That night, when she returned to collect the dress, I happened to be in the fitting room as she tried it on. She looked at herself in the glass, smoothed the fabric, and then she smiled a very soft, surprised smile, as if the weight on her shoulders had lifted just a little. "I think I shall sleep well tonight," she said, almost to herself. It may have been nothing more than the comfort of a beautiful gown, but in my heart I thought, perhaps the star is shining for her. She lowered her gaze, her lashes casting delicate shadows on her cheeks. "Since then," she added, "whenever I feel very homesick, I sew a little star for someone, not always in dresses, sometimes in a child's cloak, sometimes in a handkerchief. Once, even in the corner of a tablecloth a woman brought in to be mended. It makes me feel as if I am quietly tying a bit of silver thread from my heart to theirs, so that we are not quite strangers, so that, for at least one night, the dark will feel less empty to them." Her fingers stroked the spool once more. Then she set it gently on the table for them all to see. The candlelight touched it, and for a moment, the thin line of thread nearest the edge gleamed so delicately that it did indeed resemble a strand of moonlight captured and wound. "I keep it on a little nail beside my bed here," Elsie said softly. "Most nights, I only look at it and think of my grandmother, of her garden and the hills and the stream. But tonight," she hesitated, then looked up with a shy, luminous smile. "Tonight I think I should like to sew a star for this house, if that is not too foolish. Perhaps in the corner of the cloth, where it will not show, so that, when we go upstairs later and the rooms grow quiet, there will be a little silver thread of our being together, stitched into the very table where we sat." There was a soft murmur of agreement around the table, a gentle warmth that needed no grand words. Tom nodded, his eyes bright. "I'd trust a stitch of yours over most things," he said simply. "If you sew a star for this house, I reckon it will shine, whether we see it or not. And if the thread carries our hearts, Mr. Finch added in his mild, thoughtful way, "then, perhaps, when we are each in our beds tonight, your star will remind us that we have not supped alone this Christmas, that there is a quiet connection, like a line of light, running from door to door." Miss Clara reached out, very carefully, and with a fingertip touched the edge of the spool. "Then let it be so," she murmured. "A star for the boarding house, a silver thread to bind one gentle evening to our memories." For a moment, the four of them sat in peaceful stillness, their thoughts gently joined by the image of that invisible, shining line. The candles flickered as if in approval, sending soft reflections rippling across the glass and silver. Outside, the snow continued its slow, patient fall, each flake a tiny, silent star drifting down from the dark sky. It seemed just then that the whole world was stitched together by 1,000 unseen threads, rivers running under moonlight, letters crossing distances, tiny stars sewn into hems, and the tender, silver cords of affection that tied 4 boarders and a landlady to one another around a simple Christmas table in a quiet house folded softly into the winter night. For a time after Elsie's quiet confession about her secret stars and the silver thread, the little company sat in a kind of hushed contentment. It was as though each new story had laid a soft layer over the evening, one upon another, until the whole room felt gently padded with shared memories. The candles glowed with a steady golden calm, their flames slender and peaceful, and the shadows they cast along the walls were no longer sharp but blurred at the edges, like outlines softened by mist. In the parlor beyond, the fire burned low and deep, its light flickering faintly at the dining room doorway, a subtle echo of the gleam on the table. Outside, the snow continued its slow descent, straight and patient, turning the street into a quiet, silver path beneath the pale winter moon. Mr. Finch had listened to the tales of river and garden and silver thread with the particular attention of one who has spent a lifetime watching things pass by from a moving window. His thin hands, resting near his plate, had moved now and then in small, unconscious gestures, as if measuring distances on an invisible timetable or tracing the line of an old route. The ticking of the mantel clock in the parlor reached him easily, as it always did. He was sensitive to any measured sound, to any ordered movement through time. Now, as the conversation turned naturally toward him, he seemed almost to feel the gaze of the others as a gentle change in air pressure, like the soft shift of a train coming to rest at a platform. "Well, Mr. Finch," said Mrs. Harrow quietly, her eyes bright with affection and respect, "we've had water and letters and thread this evening. It seems only right that we should hear from the man who knows the ways of time. You have sat so patiently listening. Perhaps you might let us meet that watch of yours properly now. I dare say it has seen more Christmases than most of us here." Her words were light, but they touched something deep in him. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that deepened the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "Ah," he murmured, "time and trains. I suppose I have spent my life between the two." He slipped a hand into his waistcoat pocket and drew out the watch, the familiar, rounded shape fitting into his palm as naturally as if it had grown there. The silver case, worn smooth by years of touch, caught the candlelight and returned it softly, with a subdued, velvety gleam. He laid the watch on the tablecloth for a moment, so that they all could see it. "This has followed me through snow and rain, fog and sunshine," he said gently. "I've watched platforms, clocks, and skies by its steady measure. It's not large, but it has held many journeys." His thumb moved to the little clasp at the side, and with a delicate pressure, he opened the lid, The hinge gave a soft click, and the inside of the cover shone pale and smooth, the metal reflecting a tiny, trembling candle flame. On the underside, half hidden but unmistakable, was a small engraved star. Just a simple 5-pointed mark, but clear and precise, like a miniature compass rose. "I always liked that," Elsie whispered, leaning just enough to see. "It looks as though the watch keeps its own little piece of sky inside." Mr. Finch nodded, pleased by the thought. "My wife had that star engraved," he said, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "She gave me this watch our first Christmas after I took up my post as stationmaster. I was younger then, of course, full of pride at having my own office and the responsibility of seeing trains in and out on time. She said, 'If you must live by timetables and whistles, then you should carry a star too, so you remember that time is not only measured in minutes, but in nights and seasons and the turning of the heavens.' I laughed at her then, gently, but I have never forgotten the words." He lifted the watch and held it closer to one of the candles so that the others could see the star more clearly. The faint cuts in the metal caught the light in thin, bright strokes, each point of the star shining for a moment and then dimming as he turned it. "The back, as you see," he continued, turning the watch over, "is just simple. No inscription, no fancy work. But inside, where only I would see it, she had them place this small star. So you have something bright to look at," she said, "on long nights when the world outside your window is all fog and snow." He pressed the watch to his ear for a second, though he knew its ticking as well as his own pulse. The sound reached him, even among the other quiet noises of the room. A soft, steady beat, measured and sure. "It has never failed me," he said, "not in all my years on the rails. When I think of Christmas, I do not think only of one house or one tree or one table. I think of stations and platforms smelling of coal smoke and snow, of lamps glowing in long lines, of windows bright with other people's celebrations as trains passed in the night." Tom watched him with interest, his elbow resting on the table, his hand loosely clasped. "Did you spend many Christmases at stations then?" he asked. "More than a few," Mr. Finch replied. "The railway doesn't sleep for the holidays. People travel all the more at such times, families waiting for sons to return, children peering down platforms for their fathers, parcels tied up in brown paper and string, all of them moving from place to place, and behind it all, the timetable, printed and pinned, like a music score that the trains try their best to follow." He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze growing distant, as if the candle flames had become the lamps of platforms he had once watched. "I remember one winter in particular," he said. "The year was turning hard, and the snow began early. The line I worked on ran through low, flat country, fields on either side, hedges and little streams crossing under bridges. That December, the fields became white, and the hedges wore caps of snow. The air was full of a soft, dry hush, the kind of snow that falls in fine grains and makes the world seem padded and far away. The trains ran slower, their wheels cautious on the rails, but they ran." He smiled, and the smile was tinged with a gentle nostalgia. "On Christmas Eve, I was on duty for the late trains. My wife and our little girl had gone to spend the evening with her sister in the next town, and I was to join them after the last departure, if all went well. The station was small, only 2 platforms and a modest waiting room, but that night it felt almost like a chapel. The snow muffled every step, every voice. The lamps along the platform cast small, golden circles on the whiteness, and between them the dark was very deep. The sky above was cloudy, but now and then a gap would open and a few stars would peer through, cold and clear." He glanced towards the window, where the moonlit snow of the city street echoed his words. "I remember standing at the end of the platform, the watch in my hand, listening to the tick and watching the line. In the distance, I could hear the faint, familiar rhythm of a train approaching, the metal song of wheels on rails, softened by snow. As it drew nearer, its headlamp cut a white tunnel through the swirling flakes. It arrived with a sigh, brakes hissing, steam rising in pale clouds. Doors opened, and people stepped down, their breath and voices mingling with the mist. Some hurried away to waiting carriages, faces flushed with cold and anticipation. Others remained on the train, leaning out of windows to wave or call a last word. He paused, and his eyes softened. "There was a boy on that train," he said. "No more than 12, perhaps. He wore a coat that was a little too big for him and clutched a parcel wrapped in brown paper. When the train stopped, he pressed his face to the glass, looking up and down the platform. I could see, even from my office door, that he was searching for someone. The minutes passed, the other passengers came and went, and still he stayed at the window, his breath fogging the glass, and then clearing in a small circle where his face had warmed it. I consulted my watch. I watched the station clock. I knew the train could not wait forever. At last, just as I was about to signal the guard, a woman came running onto the platform, her scarf trailing, her boots slipping a little on the snow. She was flushed and breathless, and when she saw the boy, her whole face lit like a lamp. He smiled quietly at the memory. The conductor held the door for her. Bless him. She climbed in, and I saw her gather the boy into her arms. The parcel fell to the floor, forgotten, and rolled a little way under a seat. It didn't matter. The train pulled out again into the snowy night, and for a moment, through the window, I saw their faces together, side by side, turned towards each other. Then they were gone, the lamps receding, the sound of the wheels fading into the quiet fields. I was left standing there in the soft falling snow, my watch ticking in my hand, thinking that sometimes time runs on rails, and sometimes it stops for the space of a breath while people find one another. He looked down at the silver watch, which lay open on his palm like a small, steady moon. "There were lonelier nights too," he went on, his voice calm, without complaint. "Nights when the snow fell without cease, and the wind pressed against the signal box, and no one came through for hours. Then I would sit by the window with the lamp turned low, listening to this tick." He held the watch up again, and in the quiet of the dining room, they could each just catch the faint, measured sound, like a tiny, persistent heart beating within the metal. I would watch the snow drift over the tracks, then slide away as the wind changed, leaving the rails like two dark lines stretching into nowhere. It used to seem to me then that time was like those rails, always moving forward, always disappearing into the distance, whether trains rustled along them or not. He closed the watch with a gentle snap and let it rest for a moment upon the white cloth, the little engraved star now hidden away again. "When my wife fell ill," he said, "and I had to retire to care for her as best I could, time changed its manner. It no longer came in precise arrivals and departures, in whistles and bells and the turning of points. It came in days and nights of sitting beside a bed, in the soft rhythm of breathing, in the passing of seasons outside a single window. The watch still ticked, the stars still shone inside its lid, but the minutes felt longer and softer, as if they were being unrolled slowly from a spool." He glanced briefly at Elsie's silver thread and gave a small nod, acknowledging the kinship of images. When she was gone, he finished quietly. I found myself still listening for trains that were no longer mine to send off or welcome. I would hear a distant whistle and look at my watch, though there was no longer any schedule I must keep. In the end, I came here, to this house, where the railway line is only a faint murmur beyond the streets, and I have found that time, in a place like this, feels different again. It is measured in teacups and lamplight, in the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs, in the turning of pages, in the breathing of sleepers behind closed doors. The watch still ticks, The star still shines when I open it, but now I think less of departures and more of pauses. Of evenings like this, where time seems to gather itself gently and rest among us. For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the mantel clock joined the hidden ticking of the pocket watch in a quiet duet, each beat soft and steady, like two hearts keeping different but harmonious measures. Outside, the night pressed close to the windows, not menacing but protective, its darkness lit here and there by the silver touch of moonlight on snow and slate. The city's distant sounds were reduced to a faint murmur, like the memory of a train far away, passing softly through fields under a star-pricked sky. "I think," Miss Clara said at last, her voice barely louder than a breath, "that your wife chose well when she gave you a star instead of a name. Names can fade, but a star always means light in the dark. When you listen to your watch at night, it must be like listening to a small piece of her gift, still shining." Tom nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "And all those trains," he murmured, "all those faces at the window, all those crossings in the snow. It's a bit like the river, isn't it? Different journeys, but all carried along." Elsie looked down at the tablecloth, at the place where she meant to sew her hidden star, and imagined adding, in stitches only she would know, a tiny clock beside it, its hands forever at a gentle hour. "It feels," she whispered, "as if tonight itself is a kind train, slowing down for us, giving us time to look out of the window and see the moon on the snow." Mr. Finch smiled, a deep, peaceful smile that seemed to smooth the lines of his face. He picked up the watch, slipped it carefully back into his pocket, and patted it once, lightly, as one might touch the shoulder of an old friend. "Then, let us be grateful," he said softly, "that for this one Christmas evening, time has decided to sit with us and move a little more slowly. The trains may run on, the clocks may tick, but here, in this warm, quiet room, the minutes feel very gentle indeed." The words settled around the table like a blessing. The candles burned low but steady. The shadows curved softly around chair legs and along the wall, and somewhere beyond the brick and mortar of the boarding house, the vast sky stretched over fields and rivers and tracks, pricked with distant silver stars. Within that sheltering darkness, the old stationmaster and his watch, the mechanic and his river, the secretary and her letters, the seamstress and her silver thread, and the landlady who had drawn them all together, sat for a while longer in peaceful companionship, held tenderly in the careful hands of a quiet, kindly time. After Mr. Finch's voice had fallen quiet, and his watch had disappeared once more into the familiar hollow of his pocket, the evening rested in a long, gentle pause. The plates before them were not empty, but comfortably scattered with the remnants of a well-enjoyed meal. Bread crusts and softened crumbs lay beside smears of jam that gleamed dark and rich on white china, and the last of the vegetables rested in a shallow sheen of gravy, catching the candlelight in tiny, mellow reflections. The air had grown still and warm, smelling faintly of roasted meat and evergreen, of cooling tea, and the subtle sweetness of baked apples. It was the stillness that follows contentment, when neither hunger nor haste presses anyone to move. Around the table, shoulders had softened, faces had relaxed, and the small lines of care seemed, for a moment, to have drifted away like breath on a frosty pane. At last, with the unhurried grace of long habit, Mrs. Harrow began to rise. "You have done my supper more than justice," she said, her tone light but richly satisfied. "If we sit much longer, we shall take root like the lilac bush in Miss Clara's garden." Her eyes shone with quiet amusement as she reached for the nearest plate. "We can clear away slowly. There is no hurry tonight." Tom half rose at once and gently intercepted the plate, setting it on the sideboard instead. Elsie and Miss Clara followed his example, each taking a dish or two, their movements uncoordinated but harmonious, like people learning a gentle dance together. Mr. Finch gathered the cutlery, placing forks and knives neatly in his hands, as if they were small, polite passengers being arranged in a carriage. They moved about the room in easy cooperation, the clink of china and soft murmur of thanks forming a quiet melody of its own. There was none of the clatter or haste of ordinary days, when washing up was something to be done quickly before work or sleep. Tonight, each plate seemed to carry with it a little echo of conversation, of laughter, of calm glances shared across the table. When at last the dishes were stacked in the kitchen and the table stood bare, but for the candles and the little winter rose, Elsie slipped away for a moment and returned with her sewing basket. Without a word, but with a small, shining look of determination, she knelt near one corner of the cloth and took out the spool of shimmering thread. Under the soft gaze of the others, she made the tiniest of stitches, 5 delicate points, forming a star so small it could almost have been a trick of the light. The silver thread caught the candle glow, gleamed briefly like a tiny drop of moonlight, then lay still. The star was there, quiet and hidden, its presence known only to them. When she rose, smoothing her skirt, there was a peaceful sense of something completed, as if the evening had been gently fastened to the cloth so it could not slip away unnoticed. For a little while, they lingered in the dining room, talking in low tones, their voices weaving in and out of one another like threads of different shades. Yet gradually, almost imperceptibly, the energy in the room began to change. The fullness of the supper, the warmth of the stories, and the soft embrace of the candles seemed to call for some gentle expression that was not quite words. It was Elsie who first felt it and gave it shape, though she spoke almost without thinking. "Do any of you ever sing?" she asked, in a voice so quietly tentative that at first they were not sure she had spoken aloud. When they turned toward her, she flushed and looked down at her hands. "I only thought," she went on, a little more firmly, "that we might, perhaps, sing a carol or two. My grandmother always said that Christmas night is like a kind of stairway between earth and sky, and that songs are the steps. If we sing, even softly, it feels as though something kind climbs up and down between us and the stars." Miss Clara's eyes grew thoughtful, the shadow of a smile touching her lips. "I used to sing carols with my mother," she said. "She would play the melody on the piano, and I would follow along, a little uncertain at first. I have not sung in some time." She glanced toward the doorway, where the dark shape of the stairwell waited beyond the lamplit corridor. "The acoustics in the stair," she added, almost as an afterthought, "are rather good. When someone drops a spoon on the first landing, you hear it clearly on the second." Tom gave a soft laugh at that, the sound low and easy. "I can't promise much," he said. "My voice is more workshop than music hall, but I know the old carols. We used to sing them by the river, my brothers and I, when the snow came early and the mill wheel slowed." He rubbed the back of his neck, a little shy. "If you don't mind a rough note here and there, I'll do my best." Mr. Finch tilted his head, listening briefly to the silence beyond the walls, as if already imagining how sound might travel there. "There is something very peaceful," he said, "about a song drifting up a stairwell. It reminds me of the way a train whistle sounds softer. Somehow, when heard from far across a snowy field, I suspect this old house would be glad of a little music." His eyes crinkled in a gentle smile. "I will sing if you will tolerate an old stationmaster's thin tenor." So it was that, a few minutes later, the 5 of them found themselves gathered, not in the dining room or parlor, but on the broad lower landing of the main stair. The gas lamps on the wall burned with a steady, modest light, and shadows pooled peacefully in the corners. Above them, the staircase rose in 2 slow turns, its banister polished by years of hands, its steps slightly hollowed at the center. The air was cooler here than in the dining room, touched by a faint, clean draft from under the front door, but their shared warmth lingered like an invisible shawl around their shoulders. The house seemed to draw close, attentive, its walls listening. They stood without formal arrangement, simply where it felt natural. Mrs. Harrow leaned lightly against the wall near the base of the stairs, her apron strings tied neatly at her waist. Tom rested one hand on the banister, his other thumb hooked in his pocket, his stance easy but alert. Miss Clara stood just beyond him, back straight, hands clasped quietly before her, her profile calm and composed. Elsie took her place a step or two higher, so that her voice might fall gently down over them, her fingers resting on the smooth curve of the rail. Mr. Finch stood slightly off to one side, where he could see them all, and also catch a glimpse of the front door. As if by habit, he must always keep one eye on the threshold between inside and out. For a moment, no one began. There was a small, delicate hesitation, like the pause between drawing breath and speaking a beloved name. Then Miss Clara, after tapping her fingers lightly against her palm to find the rhythm, started in a quiet, clear tone on a carol they all knew. Her voice was not strong, but it was true, the notes falling in a gentle, even line. After a bar or two, Elsie's lighter, slightly higher voice joined hers, warm and soft as the lamplight on the wall. Tom added his deeper note next, a little rough at first, then smoothing as he found where he belonged in the harmony. Mr. Finch's tenor slipped in like a familiar train joining a well-known track, and finally, Mrs. Harrow's mellow, unhurried voice filled in the spaces, rounding out the sound with a kind of quiet assurance. The words of the carol were simple and long remembered, telling of a silent night, of calm, of holy stillness, and stars overhead. As they sang, the stairwell received their voices and gave them back, softened and enriched. The sound rose and fell along the banisters, curled up toward the dim landings above, and drifted down again in gentle echoes. Each note seemed to linger for a moment in the air before dissolving into the next, so that the song became like a slow, clear stream flowing through the heart of the house. The imperfections in their voices, the catch in Tom's throat on a high phrase, the faint breathiness in Mr. Finch's tone, the slight tremble in Elsie's softer notes wove together into something tender and very human. When they finished the first carol, there was a pause, as if the house itself were taking a breath. The last notes drifted away into the stairwell, leaving behind a hush that felt warmer than silence. No one clapped or spoke at once. They simply stood, listening to the fading echo, to the steady tick of the clock in the distant parlor, and to the muted whisper of snow against the door. The light from the lamps played gently on their faces, highlighting the softened expressions, the loosened lines of worry. "Another?" Tom suggested, his voice low and slightly sheepish, as if he were surprised to hear himself ask. "There's that one about the fields and the shepherds. My mother loved that one." They began again, this time with more confidence. The tune rolled out softly along the stair, bringing with it images of wide, starlit skies and quiet hills, of fields lying under a blanket of snow, watched over by low, distant lights. As they sang, each found their voice settling into a natural place, Miss Clara taking the melody when it called for steadiness, Elsie following her in bright, gentle threads, Tom providing a grounding hum when the lines dipped low, Mr. Finch tracing a clear path through the middle, and Mrs. Harrow anchoring them all with her calm, unhurried tone. The song made the plain stairwell feel like a kind of tall, narrow chapel, its walls painted not with pictures, but with sound and shadow, and the soft gleam of gaslight on polished wood. Outside, a passerby turned the corner of the narrow street, pulling his collar closer against the cold. He had expected only the usual winter quiet, the thick hush of snow, and the distant, weary cries of newsboys. Instead, faint but unmistakable, he heard the sound of singing. It slipped out through the tiny gaps in the boarding house door and window frames, a thin, silvery ribbon of melody falling into the street. He slowed, listening. The voices were not professional or grand, but there was something very gentle in them, something that made the cold feel less sharp for a moment. He stood in the lamplight, watching the snow drift down, and let the carol wash over him like a soft wave. Then, with a small, thoughtful nod, he moved on, carrying with him the echo of that simple harmony, a quiet warmth under his coat. Inside, the boarders and their landlady sang one carol and then another, choosing the ones that spoke of peace, of stillness, of bright stars and kindly shepherds, and a child asleep while the world hushed around him. Their voices grew neither louder nor more elaborate. They remained soft, intimate, content with being no more than they were. The stairwell, with its worn steps and smooth banister, held the sound like a dear secret. The notes drifted upward toward the closed doors of the empty rooms above, brushing them lightly as if to say, "You are not forgotten. There is warmth here tonight." At last, their voices grew tired, and the songs reached their natural end. They did not stop abruptly, but rather let the last carol trail away gently, the final chord lingering on the air like the last gleam of daylight on snow. For a few moments, they remained where they were, as if reluctant to break the fragile, shining bubble of sound and warmth they had created. Then, almost in unison, they drew breath and shifted slightly, the spell not broken, but settling into something quieter, deeper. "That was very good," Mr. Finch said softly, his hand resting on the rail. "I feel as though the house has grown lighter by several degrees. I feel as though my grandmother would be pleased," Elsie added, her eyes bright with unshed tears that were not of sorrow, but of a tender fullness. "She always said the silver thread loves to hear people sing together." Miss Clara smoothed her skirt and looked up the stairs, where the shadows now seemed more like folds of soft fabric than pockets of darkness. "It is as if our voices have climbed up and hung little garlands of sound along the landings," she murmured. "I should like to think that, for one night, the rooms are less lonely because of it." Tom ran a hand through his hair, a little embarrassed but clearly moved. "I never thought I'd be singing in a stairwell on Christmas," he admitted, his mouth twisting in a half-smile. "But I'm glad we did. It's quieted something in me, made the city feel less hard." Mrs. Harrow looked at them all, her heart very full. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing such gentle music into my house. I think it will remember this night for a long time." She glanced toward the dimness above. "And now, perhaps, it is time we let the songs rest and the stairs be only stairs again. There is still cake to be cut, and after that, beds waiting, and dreams, I hope, as peaceful as the snow." Together, they moved back down from the landing, their footsteps soft on the worn wood. The echoes of their carols lingered like a fading perfume, drifting away slowly into the walls and rafters. Outside, the snow continued to fall in its patient, silent way, each flake a tiny, perfect star drawn down from the wide, silver sky. Inside, the boarding house held its breath a little more deeply, as if the music had taught it how to sleep more sweetly, wrapped in the gentle voices that had risen and fallen in its stairwell like a calm, protective tide. The stairwell slowly emptied of their voices, and they drifted back toward the dining room with the gentle air of people returning from a walk under stars. The candles on the table had burned lower, their wax pooling into soft, rounded shapes at the base, and the little winter rose in its jar drooped just slightly, as if it had grown drowsy in the warm light. Mrs. Harrow, with a practical kindness, insisted they take a small slice of apple cake each, wrapping the extra pieces in clean paper for later. The jam was set aside, the biscuits carefully returned to their tin, and the teapot refilled once more. For a few minutes, they stood and sat in loose conversation, voices low and unhurried, the words no longer heavy with memory, but light and simple, as if the stories had been placed safely in the evening and now needed no more. It was the comfortable talk that follows a long, gentle sharing. Small remarks about the snow, one or two recollections of past winters, a quiet appreciation of how the house seemed warmer than usual. In time, however, the warmth and fullness of the day, the soft strain of singing, and the deep quiet of the night began to make their eyelids heavy. The clock in the parlor chimed a late hour with soft, measured strokes, and the sound fell like a calm reminder that rest, too, was part of the evening's gift. One by one, almost reluctantly, they began to think of their rooms upstairs, the familiar beds, the folded blankets, the small personal things waiting in the lamplight. Mrs. Harrow saw the slight droop of shoulders and the way hands lingered around teacups, and she knew, with that wordless wisdom she had about such things, that it was time to let them go gently into their own quiet spaces. "Well then," she said, smoothing her apron and looking around the room with deep satisfaction, "I will not keep you until the candles burn right down to stubs. You have been generous with your company. Let us carry a little of this warmth upstairs and leave the rest to the fire." She turned to the sideboard and folded a few napkins neatly around slices of cake and small crusts of bread, offering each boarder a tiny parcel. "Something for later, if you wake and feel inclined to remember the supper," she explained. "Or for the morning, if sleep is kind and deep." Tom accepted his bundle with a shy nod of thanks, his rough fingers careful on the folded cloth. Miss Clara took hers with a quiet, appreciative smile, tucking it almost ceremoniously into her handbag, as though it were a little letter the evening had written to tomorrow. Elsie cradled her small packet as if it were both food and keepsake, the memory of jam and spice already sweet on her tongue. Mr. Finch received his with a small, old-fashioned bow of the head, as if acknowledging a kindness at a station he had not expected to find open. They exchanged their good nights in the hall, near the foot of the stairs. It was not the abrupt farewell of people eager to withdraw, but a soft, lingering leave-taking. Tom wished them all good rest in his quiet, country-bred way. Miss Clara spoke her good night in a gentle tone that carried a hint of music, shaped by the carols still resting in her throat. Elsie added a small sleep well to each name, as if she were threading a tiny blessing through the words. Mr. Finch, with a hand on the banister, offered his hope that their dreams would be on time and pleasantly unremarkable, which made them smile. Mrs. Harrow, standing near the lamp, looked at each of them with a touch of motherly pride. "May the night be soft to you," she said simply. "You have earned it." They climbed the stairs together at first, then parted one by one at their landings, like stars drifting to separate corners of the sky. Tom's boots sounded softly on the boards as he stepped into his room on the first floor. He closed the door with care, not wishing to disturb the new, tender quiet of the house. The small space greeted him with its familiar plainness. Iron bedstead neatly made, small chest of drawers, washstand, and the single square window that looked out over the narrow street. He lit the lamp only briefly to set his parcel of cake on the little table and hang his jacket on its hook. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he turned the flame low and finally out, letting the room fill with the softer light that seeped in from outside. The window pane was edged with a delicate fringe of frost, thin white feathers and ferns spreading from the corners, but the center was clear. Through it, he could see the street lying quiet under its blanket of snow, the lamplight touching the drifts in pale circles. Above the rooftops, the sky had opened in places, and a few clear stars shone cold and steady. The moon, just past its first fullness, cast a gentle silver glow over the chimneys and eaves, turning the whole city into a patchwork of quiet light and shadow. Tom pressed his hand lightly to the glass, feeling the cold seep through, and for a moment he imagined that the pale, glimmering roofs were the fields of his village in winter, the snow-covered banks of the river, the soft line of willows under starlight. He let his thoughts drift to his brothers, picturing them walking home along a narrow lane, the snow crunching under their boots, their breath rising like small clouds in the frosty air. He saw, in his mind, the little house by the mill with warm light at the windows, and he pictured a table not so different from the one downstairs, laid with bread and whatever simple fare their mother had prepared. In the stillness of his room, he allowed himself a quiet wish once more, that they were safe, that they were warm, that they were laughing at some small joke only brothers would remember. The wind moved softly past his window, a gentle, steady sound like distant water flowing under ice, and he felt strangely certain that, in some quiet way he could not name, his wish had been carried along with it. When he finally lay down, pulling the blanket up to his shoulders, the darkness did not feel empty. It was softened by the pale streak of moonlight across the floor, by the faint memory of voices in the stairwell, by the warmth of the supper still resting pleasantly in his stomach. His thoughts, like tired birds, settled one by one. As his eyes closed, he seemed to hear again the sound of the river in winter, gentle and low, and to see small sparks of light on its surface, like stars caught and carried on the slow, peaceful current. Sleep came to him quietly, like a friend who knows to enter without knocking. Along the corridor, Miss Clara's room held a different quiet, but an equally gentle one. She lit her lamp with practiced care, turning the wick just high enough to bathe the little space in a warm, golden pool. Her desk by the window awaited her, the inkwell capped, the pen resting in its small groove. On the narrow bed, the coverlet was folded back with tidy precision. She set her parcel of cake on the corner of the desk, then opened the window curtain a few inches to let the night look in. The view from her room was not grand. The opposite wall, the slant of a roof, a slender wedge of sky between chimneys. Yet, in that slice of sky, the moon shone clearly, and a single bright star hung just above the line of tiles, as if watching. She sat at the desk and untied the blue ribbon from her bundle of letters, not to read them now, but to feel the familiar weight of them in her hands. For a little while, she simply sat, listening to the hush of the house and the faint, steady ticking of the clock downstairs. Then, moved by a gentle impulse, she took a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer, opened her pen, and began a new letter to home. The nib scratched softly as she wrote, the words flowing more easily than usual, as though they had been waiting at the edges of her mind all evening. She wrote of the boarding house supper, of bread and soup, and a small roast shared in candlelight. She described Tom's river and Elsie's silver thread, Mr. Finch's watch, and the singing in the stairwell, the soft fall of snow outside the windows. She spoke of how the house had felt different tonight, as if it had stretched its walls a little wider to hold their stories. She wrote of the way the candles had burned steadily through it all, their quiet flames, like small, faithful hearts. She did not name the others. Instead, she referred to them as gentle presences, as rivers and threads and ticking stars, knowing that home would understand beyond words. When she finished, she signed with her simple, careful hand, folded the letter, and placed it with the others, tying the ribbon gently around the whole bundle. It felt to her as if she had stitched the night into her pages, so that she might carry it forward into days to come. Blowing out the lamp, she let the moonlight take its place. It spilled softly across the floorboards, pale and silver, and brushed the edge of her bed with a quiet glow. As she lay down and pulled the coverlet over her shoulders, she turned her face toward the little slice of sky. The star above the roof seemed very small, but very sure. She watched it until her eyes grew heavy, and in her drifting thoughts, it became not only a star, but the tiny engraved one inside Mr. Finch's watch, and the little sewn one on the tablecloth, and all the unseen points of light that joined hearts in silence. When sleep came, it was gentle and deep, carrying her into dreams of lilac-scented gardens and a piano playing softly in a room filled with warm, silver light. In the room above, Elsie moved with the softness of someone afraid to wake a sleeping child. She set her sewing basket on the chair and hung her dress carefully on the hook, smoothing the fabric with a tender hand. The spool of shimmering thread she placed on the small shelf beside her bed, propping it just so, where the moonlight from her narrow window could find it. When she stepped closer to the glass, she discovered that the frost had painted delicate patterns there too. Fern-like shapes and tiny, branching trees, all caught in a thin film of ice. Through the clear spaces, she could see the rooftops and the silver sky, the moon sailing peacefully among slow drifting clouds. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the cold pane and imagined, as she had since childhood, that a silver thread ran from her heart out through the glass, over the roofs, across the city, and far beyond, touching her grandmother's cottage, the hills, the little stream with its stones and flowers. Tonight, though, she felt the thread differently. It did not only stretch outward to distant places, it looped softly back through the house itself, curling around the doors and beds of her fellow boarders, stitching them together in a quiet, shining circle. The thought soothed her like a lullaby. She turned back to the bed, the floor creaking softly under her bare feet, and slipped under the covers, the sheet cool at first, then warming to her small, curled form. On the shelf, the spool of thread caught a fragment of moonlight, its surface glimmering faintly in the dark. To Elsie's sleepy eyes, it looked for a moment like a tiny moon of its own, a little silver world balanced above her. She smiled drowsily at the sight, feeling a soft, protective comfort settle over her. In her dreams, when they came, she walked along a hillside under a wide, star-filled sky. Threads of light ran across the ground like streams, joining cottage to cottage, heart to heart. And above her head, the stars themselves were stitched into soft constellations that formed shapes of watches and rivers and letters, and a small, glowing house steadied by silver lines in the gentle night. Higher still, in his quiet corner room, Mr. Finch sat on the edge of his bed with his watch open in his hand, the tiny engraved star glinting in the lamplight. He had undone his collar and set his folded clothes on the chair, but he lingered a few moments in his day clothes, as was his habit, letting the rhythm of wakefulness unwind slowly. He listened to the watch's tick, to the softer, more distant tick of the house clock, and to the near silence that lay between. No trains called to him now, no platform lamps needed checking, no last departures demanded his attention. The night stretched before him like a long, gentle track, unmarked by schedules. He rose to extinguish the lamp, pausing at the window. The city lay quiet, its chimneys outlined softly against the sky, its streets flowing with slow gleams of moonlight on snow. For a fleeting moment, he imagined he could see, far beyond the rooftops, a glimpse of dark fields and a slender strip of rail glinting faintly in the silver light, disappearing into a peaceful horizon. He smiled, shook his head at his own fancy, and drew the curtain partway, letting a thin stripe of brightness fall across the floor. Then he lay down, placing the watch on the small table by his bed, with its face turned upward, the lid closed over the star. As his eyes grew heavy, he listened to its ticking as he had on so many nights before. Yet tonight, the sound seemed different, less like the strict beat of a timetable, more like the gentle, steady pulse of the house itself, breathing softly in sleep. The memories of stations and snow, of platforms and lamps, floated through his mind, but they were softened, bathed in a quiet, silver light. He drifted into dreams where trains ran not through duty and distance, but through fields of starlight and calm rivers. their windows glowing kindly, their journeys unhurried and endlessly peaceful. All through the boarding house, behind each door, similar scenes unfolded. Small lamps dimmed, blankets pulled up, quiet thoughts unwound like skeins of thread and laid gently aside. The house grew more silent with each passing minute, but it was a full silence, rich and kind, filled with the soft residue of shared stories and song. Outside, the wind moved carefully along the brick walls, its touch more like a caress than a knock, and the snow fell in patient silver flakes, covering the roofs and sills and steps in a fresh, powdery tenderness. Moonlight rested on the eaves like a blessing, and the stars, high and clear, kept their quiet watch over the sleeping city. Downstairs, the table lay bare and calm, its secret star sewn into one corner of the cloth, unseen but present. The evergreens on the mantel breathed out their faint forest scent into the darkened room, and the little winter rose, its petals gently folded, seemed to sleep in its glass. The boarding house, wrapped in snow and moonlight, held its small collection of dreams with the same steady care it had given their waking hours. Within its walls, in that deep, peaceful quiet, 4 boarders and a landlady rested under the same roof, each in their own room, each carried into sleep by memories of river and garden, letter and song, watch and thread, while the long winter night moved softly around them like a slow silver tide. Long after the last good night had been spoken and the last door had closed, with a soft, careful click, Mrs. Harrow remained downstairs. It was not unusual. She had always been the last to sleep, the one who walked the house through its final tasks of the day. Yet tonight, as she stood alone in the corridor with the lamps casting gentle halos on the wallpaper, the quiet felt deeper, softer, touched by something more tender than mere habit. The stories that had been spoken at the supper table still lingered in the air like a fine, invisible mist, and the echo of carols seemed to rest along the stair rail in faint, hushed notes. She drew a slow breath, tasting the fading scents of roast and bread and spice, and let her shoulders loosen little by little, as if she were laying down a carefully folded cloak. She began, as she always did, with the dining room. Pushing the door open, she stepped into the now still space and was met by the gentle glow of the last remaining candle. Most had already guttered out in their own time, leaving trails of cooled wax curved like sleeping petals at their bases. Only one flame continued to burn with a quiet, steady light, its reflection shimmering faintly on the surface of the glass jar that held the winter rose. The rose's pale head drooped toward the water, its petals softly furled, as if it too had grown drowsy after the evening's attentions. The evergreen on the mantel lay restful and dark, its needles a deeper shadow against the wall, its forest scent faint but still present, like a memory of hills under snow. She moved to the table and laid her hand lightly on the cloth, palm smoothing over the woven surface. Her fingers paused, sensing the tiny irregularity where Elsie had sewn her hidden star. The stitch was so small that the eye could hardly find it, but the fingertips knew at once where the thread had tugged the fabric into a new, delicate shape. She pressed her hand gently there, as if in greeting to that little silver sign. In her mind's eye, she saw again the faces of her boarders in the candlelight, Tom's rough, earnest features softened by the memory of his river, Miss Clara's quiet profile bent over her letters, Elsie's bright eyes glowing as she spoke of her grandmother's silver thread, Mr. Finch's lined face lit from within by the sound of his watch. All of it, she thought, gathered here and stitched into the night like that small secret star. Carefully, she cupped her hand around the base of the last candle and bent toward it. She did not blow it out at once. Instead, for a moment, she simply watched the flame, slender and patient, its small tongue of fire leaning and straightening in the invisible movements of the air. Its light gilded her fingers, painting them in a soft, warm gold. "You have done your work very well," she murmured, not quite aloud. And only then did she breathe gently. The flame trembled, blossomed for a brief, bright instant, then folded in on itself and vanished, leaving a thin ribbon of smoke that coiled peacefully upward before dispersing into the dark. The room slipped into shadow, but the darkness was not empty. It felt full of warmth that had merely tucked itself away. She did not draw the curtains at once. Instead, she crossed to the window and eased the fabric aside, looking out onto the snow-wrapped street. The gas lamp on the corner cast a pale circle on the whitened cobbles, its light mingling softly with the silver glow of the moon. The houses opposite were still, their windows mostly dark, though here and there a faint glimmer suggested that not every soul had yet surrendered to sleep. The sky above had opened wide, the earlier clouds drawn aside to reveal a tranquil, star-strewn expanse. The moon rode high now, quiet and sure, laying its silver upon the rooftops and chimneys, upon the thin line of the railway in the distance, upon every curve of snow along ledge and rail. The city, usually so full of smoke and noise, lay under that gentle light as if in a calm, deep dream. For a brief, unhurried moment, Mrs. Harrow simply stood there, her hand resting on the sill, and let the sight sink into her like a deep drink of clear water. She imagined the snow far beyond the narrow street, on empty fields, on the banks of Tom's remembered river, on the little gardens of distant villages, on the roof of a cottage where an old woman might be dreaming of her granddaughter. She pictured the moonlight falling on letters inside envelopes in far-off post offices, on polished rails stretching through silent countryside, on other houses where simple suppers had been shared. It comforted her to think that the same quiet silver watched over them all, that the same gentle sky arched above every window and roof, stitching the world together in its own soft way. At last, she let the curtain fall back into place, closing the room gently against the cold brightness outside. She checked the latch on the window, tested it with a firm but quiet hand, and then moved through the rest of the house in her usual steady circuit. In the parlor, she stirred the coals just enough to be sure the fire would sink into a safe, glowing bed, keeping a soft heart of warmth alive beneath the ash until morning. The chairs, slightly askew from the evening's gathering, she straightened with small, habitual touches so that they seemed once more to face the hearth in calm, patient readiness. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its face pale in the dimness. She laid her fingers briefly on its wooden case, a polite acknowledgement between two old keepers of time. In the hallway, she turned down the gas lamps, one by one. Each flame lowered obediently, shrinking into a small, pearly glow that still lit the way, but no longer pushed so boldly at the shadows. The stairwell, which had held their singing like a tall, narrow cup, now hummed with a different music. The quiet breath of the house itself, the soft murmur of wind along the eaves, the near silence of sleeping hearts behind closed doors. The notes of the carols were gone, yet their echo seemed to remain in the air, a tender vibration in the wood and plaster, a gentle hush resting on each step. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked upward. The gaslight on the first landing cast a heartier glow, but even it was softened by the shadows around it. The banister, polished by many hands, gleamed faintly, and the bare edges of the steps caught a little of the light, like the edges of pages turned slowly in a quiet book. Behind the closed doors she saw, in her mind, rather than her eyes, the boarders at rest. Tom with his rough hands finally still, his breath deep and even, Miss Clara with her letters tied in their blue ribbon, her face turned toward some inner garden, Elsie with the little spool of silver thread watching over her like a tiny moon, Mr. Finch with his watch ticking gently on the table, the invisible star inside its lid gleaming in the darkness. The house felt filled with them, but in the peaceful way of people sleeping, their presence weightless and calm. Without quite knowing she meant to do so, she lifted one hand, fingers slightly spread, and made a small, quiet gesture in the air toward the upper floors, a movement that was not quite a wave and not quite a sign of the cross, but something of both. It was her way of acknowledging them, of touching each closed door with her thoughts. In her heart, words unfolded, simple and unadorned, carrying with them love that was modest but unwavering. May they rest gently. May their dreams be soft. May the night keep them safe, like snow smoothing the rough edges of the city. Then she turned toward the small back room she kept for herself, the one on the ground floor where she could easily hear if any call came in the night. It was a plain room with a single bed, a sturdy chair, and a chest where her few personal treasures lay folded amidst linen and old winter shawls. She lit the little lamp on the bedside table and sat down on the edge of the bed, easing off her shoes with quiet care. Her hands were tired, the skin lined with years of polishing, lifting, washing, mending, but they felt contentedly tired, not strained. They had kneaded dough, poured soup, lifted plates, smoothed cloth, tended flame. They had done all the small work that makes warmth possible. On the table, beside the lamp, lay a worn, cloth-covered book of hymns, its corners frayed, its pages softened by many turnings. She did not open it tonight. She only laid her hand on the cover for a moment, feeling the familiar ridges beneath her palm, like the touch of old, trusted words. Then she reached to turn down the lamp, leaving only a faint, steady glow that brushed the ceiling with a pale, comforting stain of light. Through the thin wall she could hear, not the precise details, but the gentle sense of others nearby. A creak here, a sigh there, the soft, almost imperceptible shifting of a building that had settled into its own kind of sleep. Before lying down, she knelt briefly beside the bed. It was not a grand gesture, not ceremonious. It was the quiet bending of someone who had spent her life making small, earnest petitions. The words that rose in her mind were not formal prayers, but simple, heartfelt thoughts spoken inwardly into the stillness. For the mechanic who misses his river, keep his heart steady and his hands safe. For the secretary who writes to an unseen home, let her find, in time, a place that answers her letters. For the young seamstress with the silver thread, keep her gentle hope from fraying. For the retired stationmaster with his watch and star, let his remaining journeys be calm and kind. For all those beyond these walls who have no table or song tonight, let there be at least a little light, a little warmth, a little peaceful corner of the world to rest in. When she lay down at last and drew the blanket over herself, she felt the day settle over her like a second coverlet. Its moments of work and preparation, its small anxieties, its quiet triumph of bringing strangers a little nearer to one another. Her eyes closed slowly. In the soft drift of sleep that rose around her, she imagined the boarding house from above, its roof gently peaked and dusted with snow, its windows dark and still, its chimneys breathing out thin threads of smoke that rose into the silvered night. Around it, the city lay like a great, slumbering beast, tamed by winter, its noise muted, its edges softened. Above all, the sky stretched wide and calm, speckled with faint, distant stars, the moon keeping its watch with patient, gentle light. For a long time, the house and its sleeping occupants lay cradled in that deep, quiet darkness, while the snow continued its slow, steady fall. Each flake drifted down like a soft wish or a silent blessing, settling on rooftops, on bare branches, on the narrow street, building up a tender, white hush. The boarding house, that small island of warmth in an industrial city, seemed wrapped not only in brick and mortar, but in something softer, in memory, in shared stories, in the threads of invisible kindness that had been woven through its rooms this Christmas night. And so, within this little world of lamplight and snow, of moon and soft breathing, a blessing lay over the sleeping house, a blessing of gentle dreams, of peaceful hearts, of quiet nights and kind mornings. It was a blessing that did not stop at the walls, but drifted outward into the winter air, following the silver light along the roofs, gliding over streets and fields and rivers, touching far-off cottages and high windows, resting wherever a weary heart lay down to sleep. It was a simple blessing, yet deep and steady as a calm tide. May your night be soft and silver. May your thoughts grow quiet and kind. May your dreams be warm and gentle, like lamplight behind a curtained window, like moonlight on still water, like snow falling slowly in a peaceful street. May you be held, for a little while, in a deep, untroubled sleep, and wake, when morning comes, to a world made just a little softer by the memory of this quiet, tender night.